The walls of Constantinople stood for 11 centuries, outlasting empires that rose and crumbled in mere generations, a city where Latin gave way to Greek, where Roman law bent toward Eastern mystery, and where golden mosaics caught the light of 1,000 years of prayer and politics. There is something restful in contemplating such endurance, such slow accumulation of beauty and conflict and faith, all layered upon the same ancient stones beside the Bosphorus. If these quiet histories bring some ease to the evening hours, a subscription might mean more of them finding their way to you in nights to come. But for now, the year is 330, and an emperor named Constantine has chosen a small Greek colony called Byzantium to bear his name and his ambitions, and from that moment, a millennium unfolds, unhurried, inevitable, and we begin there. In the early years of the 4th century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire stretched across a vast expanse of territory, from the misty shores of Britain in the northwest to the sun-warmed sands of Egypt in the southeast, and the administration of such an enormous realm had become, as one might imagine, an increasingly complex and burdensome undertaking. The empire had, by this time, weathered numerous crises, including decades of civil war, economic instability, and pressure along its extensive frontiers. And it was into this world of uncertainty and transformation that a man named Constantine emerged, a figure whose decisions would reshape the course of history in ways that continue to echo through the centuries. Though, of course, at this particular moment in our quiet evening together, we need not concern ourselves overly much with the drama of it all, but rather settle into the gentle unfolding of events as they happened, one after another, like stones placed carefully along a garden path. Constantine was born around the year 272 in the city of Naissus, which lies in the region we now know as Serbia, and his father was a military officer named Constantius who would eventually rise to become one of the emperors in the Tetrarchy, that system of shared rule established by Diocletian to manage the unwieldy empire. The young Constantine grew up in the imperial court, receiving an education befitting his station and learning the arts of warfare and governance that would serve him in the turbulent years ahead, though we shall not dwell too heavily on the various military campaigns and political maneuverings of his early career, as these details, while fascinating in their own way, might prove rather too stimulating for our present purposes of gentle contemplation before sleep. What concerns us most directly is the series of events that began in the autumn of the year 312, when Constantine found himself marching southward through Italy toward the city of Rome itself, preparing to face his rival Maxentius in a confrontation that would determine which of them would rule the western portion of the empire. According to the accounts that have come down to us through various ancient sources, including the writings of Eusebius of Caesarea and Lactantius, Constantine experienced a remarkable vision either in a dream or while gazing at the sky, depending upon which version of the story one prefers. And in this vision he perceived a symbol, often described as a cross of light or perhaps the Chi-Rho monogram representing the first letters of Christ's name in Greek, accompanied by words that have been rendered in Latin as in hoc signo vinces, meaning in this sign you shall conquer. Whether this vision was a genuine mystical experience, a dream brought on by the anxieties of impending battle, or perhaps a later embellishment added to the historical record, we cannot say with certainty, and indeed, for our peaceful purposes this evening, the precise nature of the event matters rather less than its consequences. For Constantine did indeed order his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol, and on the 28th day of October in the year 312, at a place called the Milvian Bridge spanning the Tiber River just north of Rome, his forces met and defeated the army of Maxentius, who drowned in the river during the chaotic retreat of his troops. The victory at the Milvian Bridge elevated Constantine to mastery of the Western Empire, and in the years that followed, he would gradually consolidate his power over the entire Roman world, eventually becoming sole emperor after defeating his final rival Licinius in the year 324. It was during this period of increasing authority and stability that Constantine began to turn his thoughts toward a matter of considerable practical importance, namely the question of where the empire might best be governed from. For Rome itself, though hallowed by centuries of tradition and still bearing its ancient title as the Caput Mundi or head of the world, was no longer ideally situated for the demands of imperial administration in an age when the most pressing threats came from the east, from the Persian Empire and from various peoples moving along the Danube frontier. Several cities were apparently considered as potential sites for a new imperial capital, including Serdica, the modern Bulgarian city of Sophia, which Constantine is reported to have admired greatly and which offered a reasonably central location, as well as Thessalonica, the major port city of Macedonia with its excellent harbor and established infrastructure, and even the ancient city of Troy was supposedly contemplated, which would have carried with it a certain poetic resonance given the Roman tradition that traced the origins of their people back to Aeneas and the Trojan refugees. Each of these locations possessed certain advantages, but in the end, Constantine's attention settled upon a rather modest Greek city situated at a remarkably strategic point where the continents of Europe and Asia nearly touch, separated only by the narrow strait of the Bosphorus. This city was called Byzantium, and its history stretched back many centuries before Constantine's time, to an era when Greek colonists were establishing settlements around the shores of the Mediterranean and Black Seas. According to the founding legend, which the Greeks themselves told, the city had been established around the middle of the 7th century before the Common Era by a man named Byzas, who hailed from the city of Megara on the Greek mainland. The story relates that Byzas consulted the oracle at Delphi before setting out on his colonizing expedition, and the oracle advised him to settle opposite the land of the blind, a cryptic instruction that puzzled him until he arrived at the Bosphorus and observed that earlier Greek settlers had established the colony of Chalcedon on the Asian shore, apparently failing to recognize the vastly superior location available on the European side, where a magnificent natural harbor called the Golden Horn provided safe anchorage, and where the surrounding waters teemed with fish, particularly the great runs of tuna that passed through the strait each year. And so Byzas, perceiving that the founders of Chalcedon must indeed have been blind to overlook such an advantageous site, established his colony on the European promontory, and Byzantium grew over the centuries into a prosperous though never particularly large or powerful city, changing hands various times and suffering destruction during Roman civil wars before being rebuilt. It was this ancient settlement, with its superb harbor and its command of the strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, that Constantine now chose to transform into nothing less than a new Rome, a fresh center of imperial power that would bear his own name and stand as a monument to his reign. The formal ceremony marking the beginning of work on the new city took place on the 8th day of November in the year 324, not long after Constantine's final victory over Licinius, and the emperor himself is said to have traced out the boundaries of the expanded city on foot, walking far beyond the modest walls of old Byzantium while his attendants followed along, some of them reportedly growing rather concerned at the extent of territory he was claiming. When asked how far he intended to go, Constantine is supposed to have replied that he would continue until the invisible guide walking before him decided to stop, a remark that suggests either a genuine sense of divine direction or perhaps a touch of imperial theater, or possibly both. as the two were not mutually exclusive in the Roman world. The construction that followed over the next 6 years was remarkably ambitious, involving the labor of countless workers and the expenditure of enormous resources. For Constantine wished his new city to rival and eventually surpass old Rome in its grandeur and appointments. The site itself possessed a natural topography that proved convenient for this purpose, as it featured 7 hills, though some of these were perhaps rather modest elevations that required a certain generosity of interpretation, mirroring the famous 7 hills upon which Rome had been built. And this geographical parallel was quite deliberately emphasized to reinforce the connection between the ancient capital and its eastern successor. The city's infrastructure was developed with considerable care, including the expansion of an existing hippodrome, that great oval stadium designed for chariot racing which would become such a central feature of Byzantine public life in the centuries to come. Constantine enlarged this structure significantly, modeling it upon the Circus Maximus in Rome, though it was considerably smaller than that enormous venue, and he decorated its central spine, called the Spina, with monuments and sculptures brought from various parts of the empire, creating a remarkable outdoor museum of classical art that visitors would admire for many hundreds of years. Among the treasures installed in the hippodrome was an object of great antiquity and religious significance, a column formed of 3 intertwined bronze serpents that had originally stood at the sanctuary of Apollo in Delphi, where it had been erected as a victory monument by the Greek city-states following their defeat of the Persian invasion in 479 before the Common Era. This serpent column, as it came to be known, represented just one example of Constantine's policy of adorning his new capital with statuary and architectural elements removed from temples and public spaces throughout the empire, a practice that stripped many ancient sites of their accumulated artistic heritage but which concentrated an extraordinary collection of classical art in Constantinople. A modest church was constructed and dedicated to Hagia Sophia, meaning holy wisdom, though this original building was a relatively simple structure quite different from the magnificent domed basilica that would later rise on the same site under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. Nevertheless, this first Hagia Sophia represented the Christian character that Constantine wished to impart to his new foundation, distinguishing it from Rome with all its pagan associations and ancient temples. Though Constantine was pragmatic enough to include traditional Roman civic features as well, understanding that the transformation of religious culture would be a gradual process. At the heart of the city, serving as the point from which all distances in the Eastern Empire would henceforth be measured, Constantine established a monument called the millennium, a golden milestone that functioned as the Eastern counterpart to the famous Millennium or Rome in Rome. This structure marked the symbolic center of the new capital and provided a reference point for the network of roads that connected Constantinople to the provinces, just as all roads had traditionally been said to lead to Rome. The formal dedication of the city took place on the 11th day of May in the year 330. A date that would be celebrated annually in the Byzantine calendar for many centuries thereafter, and the ceremonies marking this occasion were elaborate affairs combining Christian and traditional Roman elements in a manner characteristic of this transitional period in religious history. Constantine himself presided over the festivities, which included chariot races in the hippodrome and the distribution of bread to the populace, establishing patterns of imperial ceremonial that would persist long after his death. The strategic genius of Constantine's choice of location became increasingly apparent as the decades and centuries passed, for the city commanded the narrow waters of the Bosphorus through which passed the vital grain ships carrying the harvests of the Black Sea region to feed the populations of the eastern Mediterranean. Control of this choke point gave Constantinople enormous economic and military leverage, and the city's position on a defensible peninsula, protected by water on 3 sides and eventually by massive walls on the 4th, made it extraordinarily difficult to capture, as would be demonstrated repeatedly throughout its long history. And so, as we settle more deeply into the quietude of this evening hour, we may reflect gently upon how Constantine's decision, made in the years following his vision at the Milvian Bridge, set in motion a chain of events that would see his city endure for more than 1,000 years as the capital of an empire that considered itself, quite reasonably, to be the continuation of Rome itself, preserving classical learning and Christian faith through centuries of change and challenge, its golden domes and massive walls standing watch over the straits where Europe and Asia meet, and where the waters of the Black Sea flow down toward the warmer Mediterranean, carrying with them the commerce of nations and the gentle passage of time. In the long history of the Byzantine Empire, few reigns have captured the imagination of later generations quite so thoroughly as that of Justinian I, who ruled from Constantinople for nearly 4 decades, from the year 527 until his death in 565 of the Common Era. His reign was marked by tremendous ambition, by catastrophic disaster, by legal reforms that would shape European civilization for more than 1,000 years, and perhaps most remarkably of all, by his partnership with an empress whose origins could not have been more different from the purple chambers of the imperial palace. Theodora, who would become one of the most powerful women in Roman history, began her life in circumstances that Roman law itself deemed so lowly that she was forbidden from marrying into the senatorial class, and it was Justinian himself who had to change that ancient law before he could make her his wife. To understand Theodora's origins, we must first picture the Hippodrome of Constantinople, that great curved stadium that lay just beside the imperial palace, where chariot races drew crowds of 80,000 spectators or more, and where the passions of the city found their most fervent expression. The Hippodrome was not merely a place of entertainment, though it was certainly that, but also a center of political expression, of factional loyalty, and of the complex social life that made Constantinople the most vibrant city in the medieval world. Theodora's father was a man named Acacius, who worked as a bear-keeper for the Green faction, one of the 2 great chariot racing organizations that dominated the Hippodrome and, in many ways, the political life of the city itself. Bearkeepers were responsible for the care and training of animals used in the entertainments that accompanied the races, the wild beast shows and performances that filled the intervals between the thundering of hooves and wheels around the great spina. When Acacius died, leaving his widow and 3 young daughters without support, the family found itself in desperate circumstances, and Theodora's mother did what she could to secure their survival in the brutal social hierarchy of the ancient world. The girls were eventually put on the stage, which in the Roman world meant something rather different from what we might imagine today. Actresses in Constantinople occupied a peculiar social position, entertaining vast crowds with performances that ranged from comic sketches to more risque entertainments, and they were classified under Roman law alongside prostitutes and courtesans, forbidden from wearing certain colors or fabrics, and prohibited from marrying men of senatorial rank. Theodora grew up in this world, performing from childhood alongside her elder sister, learning the skills of mime and comedy and dance that made her famous throughout the city, and also, according to the hostile accounts of the historian Procopius, engaging in the less respectable aspects of the theatrical profession. We should pause here to note that much of what we know about Theodora's early life comes from Procopius's Secret History, a text written by a court historian who also produced official accounts praising Justinian and Theodora in the most glowing terms. but who privately composed this scandalous alternative narrative filled with salacious accusations and bitter criticism. Historians have long debated how much of the secret history to believe, and the consensus today suggests that while Theodora certainly came from the theatrical world and all that implied in Roman society, many of the more extreme claims should be treated with considerable skepticism. What seems certain is that she was intelligent, beautiful, possessed of considerable charisma, and determined to escape the circumstances of her birth. At some point in her 20s, Theodora left Constantinople and traveled to North Africa with a government official, and when that relationship ended, she made her way slowly back to the capital, stopping for a time in Alexandria, where according to some accounts she encountered Monophysite Christianity, a form of the faith that differed from the official Chalcedonian position on the nature of Christ. When she returned to Constantinople, she had left the stage behind and was working more quietly as a wool spinner, living in a modest house, and it was during this period that she caught the attention of Justinian, who was at that time the heir apparent to his uncle, the Emperor Justin I. Justinian was already in his 40s when he met Theodora, who was perhaps 20 years younger, and by all accounts he fell deeply and genuinely in love with her. The obstacle to their marriage was not merely social disapproval, though there was certainly that in abundance, but Roman law itself, which explicitly prohibited men of senatorial rank from marrying actresses or former actresses. Justinian, with the cooperation of his uncle the emperor, arranged for this law to be changed, and in doing so he created a new legal principle that allowed actresses who had genuinely reformed their lives to escape the legal disabilities of their former profession. The law was written in general terms, but everyone in Constantinople understood that it had been crafted specifically so that Justinian could marry Theodora, and marry her he did, making her first his wife and then, when Justin died in 527, his empress and co-ruler. The partnership between Justinian and Theodora was genuine and deep, lasting until her death from cancer in 548, and throughout their years together she exercised a degree of power that was remarkable even by Byzantine standards, where empresses often wielded considerable influence. She had her own court, her own sources of information, and her own policy interests, and Justinian relied upon her judgment in matters both domestic and foreign. Some historians have characterized their relationship as a kind of dual monarchy, though this perhaps overstates the formal position while accurately capturing something of its practical reality. The great crisis of their reign came early, in January of 532, when the two great circus factions, the Blues and the Greens, set aside their usual violent rivalry and united against the imperial government. The immediate causes of the Nika riots, as they came to be called, were complex, involving anger at two imperial officials, John the Cappadocian and Tribonian, who were widely hated for their corruption and their role in enforcing unpopular taxes. The riot began in the Hippodrome during the races, when the crowd began chanting Nika, a Greek word meaning conquer or victory, which was the usual cry of encouragement to the chariot teams but which now became a revolutionary slogan directed against the emperor himself. For nearly a week, the rioting continued, and vast portions of Constantinople were put to the torch. The original church of Hagia Sophia, which had stood since the time of Constantius II, was burned to the ground, along with the nearby church of St. Irene, the Senate House, and large sections of the city centre. The rioters proclaimed a new emperor, a reluctant nobleman named Hypatius who was brought to the Hippodrome and acclaimed by the crowd, and for several terrible days it seemed that Justinian's reign would end in fire and blood. According to the account preserved by Procopius, Justinian and his advisors gathered in the palace to debate whether they should flee the city by boat, abandoning Constantinople to the mob and hoping to regroup and return with loyal forces. The general Belisarius was present, as was the eunuch Narses and other members of the inner circle, and it seemed that the consensus was moving toward flight when Theodora spoke. Her words, as recorded by Procopius, have become among the most famous in Byzantine history, though we should remember that ancient historians often composed speeches for their subjects rather than recording them verbatim. She is said to have reminded those present that every person must die, but that for one who has reigned, to become a fugitive is intolerable. She spoke of the imperial purple, saying that it makes a fine shroud, suggesting that she would rather die as an empress than live as an exile. Whether or not she spoke these precise words, the outcome was clear, for Justinian resolved to stay and fight. The suppression of the Nika riots was entrusted to Belisarius and another general, Mundus, who led loyal troops, many of them Germanic mercenaries with no particular attachment to the circus factions or sympathy for the rioters. The rebels had gathered in the Hippodrome, tens of thousands of them, perhaps to witness the coronation of Hypatius or simply because the great stadium was the natural gathering place for any mass movement in Constantinople. The imperial forces entered the Hippodrome through multiple gates and began a systematic massacre. The ancient sources give varying numbers, but the figure most often cited is 30,000 dead, their bodies piling up on the sands where chariots had raced and where Theodora's father had once tended his bears. Hypatius was captured and executed, his body thrown into the sea, and the Nika riots were over. In the aftermath of this catastrophe, Justinian embarked upon an ambitious program of rebuilding and reform. The legal scholar Tribonian, who had been temporarily dismissed during the riots to appease the mob, was restored to office and given the task of completing the great legal codification that would become known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This massive project, which had begun before the riots and continued afterward, gathered together the accumulated legal wisdom of the Roman Empire, organizing centuries of imperial edicts, legal opinions, and judicial decisions into a coherent system that could be studied and applied. The Corpus Juris Civilis would become the foundation of legal education and practice throughout medieval Europe, influencing the development of civil law traditions that continue to shape legal systems around the world to this day. The burned churches were rebuilt on a grander scale than before, and the new Hagia Sophia, designed by the mathematicians Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, rose to become one of the most extraordinary buildings in human history, its great dome seeming to float above the vast interior space in a way that contemporaries described as miraculous. Justinian is said to have entered the completed church and declared that he had surpassed Solomon, referring to the ancient temple in Jerusalem, though whether he actually spoke these words or whether they were attributed to him by later tradition, we cannot say with certainty. The military campaigns of Justinian's reign, directed largely by the brilliant general Belisarius, sought to reclaim the western provinces of the old Roman Empire that had fallen to Germanic kingdoms in the previous century. North Africa was reconquered from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and portions of Spain from the Visigoths, though these conquests proved costly and difficult to maintain. Belisarius himself remains one of the most fascinating figures of the age, a general of remarkable talent whose relationship with Justinian was marked by both trust and suspicion, and whose wife Antonina was a close friend and ally of Theodora. Throughout these years, Theodora pursued her own interests and causes, including a notable concern for the rights and welfare of women. She advocated for laws that protected women from being forced into prostitution, that gave women greater rights in divorce proceedings, and that provided refuge for women who had been trafficked or exploited. She established a convent on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus where former prostitutes could live in safety and dignity, though some later accounts suggest that not all the women housed there were entirely grateful for this compulsory redemption. She also maintained an extensive network of informants and agents, gathering intelligence from across the empire and beyond, and the palace complex included secret chambers and passages where those who had fallen from favor could be confined or where sensitive meetings could be held away from the general awareness of the court. The year 541 brought a catastrophe of a different kind, when a devastating plague reached Constantinople, probably carried by rats on grain ships from Egypt. The plague of Justinian, as it came to be known, was almost certainly caused by the same bacterium that would cause the Black Death 8 centuries later, and its effects were similarly devastating. The plague killed perhaps a quarter to a half of Constantinople's population in its initial outbreak, and Justinian himself fell ill, though he recovered. Across the empire and beyond, the death toll may have reached 25 million or more over the following decades, as the plague returned in successive waves, fundamentally altering the economic and military position of the empire. In the church of San Vitoli in Ravenna, which was completed during Justinian's reign after the reconquest of Italy, two remarkable mosaic panels preserve the images of the imperial couple, each surrounded by their attendants and courtiers. Justinian appears with his officials and soldiers and clergy, while Theodora stands with her ladies-in-waiting, both of them frozen forever in the glittering tesserae, gazing out at visitors with the solemn hieratic stare of Byzantine imperial art. The bearkeeper's daughter wears the imperial purple, crowned and bejeweled, her face serene and authoritative, as eternal as the gold background against which she stands. In the year 532 of the Common Era, the city of Constantinople lay partially in ruins, scarred by the devastating Nika riots that had nearly cost the Emperor Justinian his throne. And it was in this moment of recovery, this quiet aftermath of chaos, that the emperor conceived of a building project so ambitious that many of his advisors surely thought it impossible, though they were perhaps too wise to say so directly. The original church of Hagia Sophia, which means holy wisdom in the Greek tongue, had stood on that site for nearly 2 centuries before the rioters reduced it to ash and rubble. And now Justinian wished not merely to rebuild what had been lost but to create something the world had never seen, a structure that would stand as testament to the glory of God and, not incidentally, to the glory of his own reign. And so he set about gathering the finest minds in his empire to make this dream a reality. What makes the story of Hagia Sophia particularly interesting, in the gentle sort of way that architectural history can be interesting when one is settling in for a restful evening, is that Justinian did not turn to architects in the traditional sense when he sought builders for his great church, but rather to 2 men whose primary expertise lay in the realm of mathematics and geometry, and this choice would prove to be either an act of inspired genius or simply the recognition that what he wanted to achieve required minds unconstrained by conventional assumptions about what buildings could and could not do. The first of these men was Anthemius of Tralles, a mathematician and physicist who had written treatises on conic sections and the properties of mirrors, and who understood the behavior of curves and forces in ways that practical builders of his era did not typically consider. The second was Isidore of Miletus, Another mathematician who had compiled the works of Archimedes and Euclid, and who brought to the project a deep understanding of geometric principles that would prove essential in solving the central challenge of the design, which was how to place a circular dome atop a square building without the whole thing collapsing under the tremendous forces involved. The problem they faced was not a simple one, and perhaps we might take a moment to appreciate its difficulty in the most relaxed and unhurried manner possible. For understanding this challenge helps us appreciate the elegance of their solution. When you place a dome on top of a circular building, as the Romans had done with the Pantheon, the weight of the dome distributes itself evenly around the circular walls, pressing downward and outward in a continuous ring of force that the walls can resist quite effectively. But when your building is rectangular, as basilica-style churches traditionally were, you have a square space that you wish to cover with a round dome, and the corners of that square present a geometrical and structural puzzle that had vexed builders for generations. Anthemius and Isidore solved this puzzle through the refined use of pendentives, which are curved triangular sections of masonry that rise from the corners of the square and curve inward and upward, gradually transitioning from the flat vertical walls below to the circular base of the dome above. And while pendentives had been used before in smaller structures, no one had attempted them at anything approaching this scale. The dome they designed would span 102 feet in diameter, which is roughly 31 meters for those who think in such terms, and it would rise to a height of 180 feet above the floor of the nave, creating an interior space of such vast openness that visitors would feel, quite intentionally, as though they stood beneath the vault of heaven itself. To achieve this, the construction required not only mathematical genius but also an enormous workforce and resources gathered from across the empire, and the historical sources tell us that approximately 10,000 workers labored on the site during the 5 years of construction, which seems a staggering number until one considers the scope of what they were attempting and the relatively short time frame in which Justinian demanded it be completed. The coordination of so many workers, performing so many different tasks simultaneously, presented its own challenges, and here we encounter one of those details that makes ancient construction feel suddenly human and relatable even across the vast distance of 15 centuries. The workers, we are told, sang hymns as they labored, using the rhythm and cadence of religious songs to coordinate their efforts, to time the lifting of heavy stones, and to synchronize the placement of bricks so that multiple teams could work in harmony without the confusion that might otherwise result from thousands of voices calling out instructions. One can imagine, if one is in a peaceful and contemplative frame of mind, the sound of those voices rising and falling across the construction site, a great chorus of labor that transformed the act of building into something approaching a continuous act of worship, which would have seemed entirely appropriate given that they were constructing what they hoped would be the greatest church in Christendom. The materials for this massive undertaking came from across the known world, gathered with an imperial determination that brooked no obstacles. Special lightweight bricks were manufactured on the island of Rhodes, using a particular type of clay that produced bricks significantly less dense than ordinary ones, and these lighter bricks were essential for the dome itself, reducing the tremendous weight that the supporting structure would need to bear. Legend holds that these Rhodian bricks were so light that 12 of them weighed no more than a single ordinary brick. And while this may be something of an exaggeration in the way that legends often are, the basic principle was sound. For every pound saved in the dome was a pound less of force pushing outward on the walls and pendentives below. To support the dome and to give the interior its sense of grandeur, columns were needed, great monolithic shafts of marble and porphyry, and Justinian's agents scoured the ancient world for suitable specimens, finding them in the ruins of temples and buildings whose glory days had long since passed. 8 columns of green marble were brought from the ruins of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which had itself been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over the centuries and now gave up some of its remaining fabric to create a new wonder. Other columns came from the Temple of the Sun at Baalbek, and from various sites in Egypt, each one carefully transported over land and sea to Constantinople, where they would support the weight of Anthemius and Isidore's impossible dome and contribute their ancient dignity to a new monument of the Christian faith. The construction proceeded with remarkable speed, driven by Justinian's impatience and the fear that such impatience inspired in those who served him. And on the 27th day of December in the year 537, just 5 years, 10 months, and 4 days after construction had begun, the church was dedicated in a ceremony of extraordinary splendor. It was at this dedication, according to the historical sources, that Justinian walked into the completed nave, gazed upward at the dome floating impossibly above him, and spoke words that have echoed through history, declaring that Solomon, he had surpassed, referring to the legendary Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, which had been considered the most magnificent religious structure ever built by human hands. Whether Justinian actually spoke these words, or whether they were attributed to him later by chroniclers who wished to emphasize the magnificence of the achievement, we cannot say with certainty, but the sentiment captures the ambition and the pride that the building was meant to embody. Inside the completed church, the effect was everything that Justinian and his mathematicians had hoped for, and more. The dome seemed to float above the nave, not resting heavily on its supports as domes typically did, but hovering as if suspended from heaven by a golden chain, as one contemporary writer poetically described it. This illusion of weightlessness was created in part by the 40 windows that pierced the base of the dome, arranged in a ring around its circumference, allowing light to pour through and dissolve the visual connection between the dome and the structure below. The light streaming through these windows illuminated the gold mosaics that covered the interior of the dome, creating a shimmering, ever-changing display as the sun moved across the sky, and visitors reported feeling as though the dome itself was made of light rather than brick and mortar. The interior was decorated with a lavishness that staggered the imagination of all who saw it, with marble panels covering the lower walls in patterns that suggested waves or flames or abstract gardens of stone, and gold mosaics covering nearly every upper surface. The sanctuary area, where the most sacred rites were performed, contained 40,000 pounds of silver, worked into screens and altar fittings and lampstands, creating a display of wealth that was meant not merely to impress human visitors but to honor the divine presence that the building was meant to house. The floors were covered in intricate marble patterns, the columns gleamed with their ancient polish, and the whole interior was designed to overwhelm the senses and transport worshippers into a state of religious awe. But the laws of physics, while they may be bent by human ingenuity, cannot be broken entirely, and the magnificent dome that Anthemius and Isidore had designed proved to be, if not quite impossible, then certainly precarious. 20 years after the dedication, in the year 558, a series of earthquakes struck Constantinople, and the accumulated stresses in the dome, which had perhaps been slowly increasing since the building's completion, finally exceeded what the structure could bear. The dome collapsed, crashing down into the nave and destroying much of the interior that had been so laboriously decorated, and Justinian, now an old man in the final years of his long reign, faced the task of rebuilding his monument. The reconstruction was entrusted to Isidore the Younger, who was the nephew of the original Isidore and had presumably learned much from his uncle about both the triumphs and the limitations of the first design. The younger Isidore's solution was elegant in its simplicity. He rebuilt the dome with a steeper curve, raising the crown approximately 20 feet higher than it had been before, which changed the geometry of the forces involved and reduced the outward thrust that had contributed to the original collapse. The new dome was also reinforced with additional ribs and strengthened at its base, creating a structure that has proven more durable than its predecessor, surviving earthquakes and the long centuries since with only partial collapses that were themselves repaired. The dome we see today, if we are fortunate enough to visit the building, is essentially the dome that Isidore the Younger created, modified only by the repairs that have accumulated over nearly 1,500 years. Among the many intriguing features of Hagia Sophia is a column in the northwest corner of the building, covered in bronze plates, which has acquired over the centuries a reputation for mysterious and possibly miraculous properties. This column, sometimes called the sweating column or the weeping column, is marked by a small hole where visitors have, for many centuries, inserted their fingers or thumbs, believing that the moisture present in the column possesses healing properties. The column does indeed feel cool to the touch, and there is often moisture present, which may be explained by the simple physics of condensation in a building of such mass and particular thermal properties. But the faithful have attributed to it various cures and blessings over the centuries, and the worn brass around the hole testifies to the countless hands that have touched it seeking relief from ailments of body and spirit. And then there is the matter of the Viking graffiti, which brings us to a delightfully human detail hidden in the upper galleries of this most sacred space. High above the nave, where visitors in Byzantine times would have gathered to observe the rituals below, someone at some point during the medieval period carved runes into the marble railing, and when scholars examined these scratches in the 19th century, they determined that the runic inscription reads, in the Old Norse tongue, something to the effect of Halfdan was here, and possibly Halfdan carved these runes as well, though the inscription is worn and difficult to read with complete certainty. This Halfdan was almost certainly a member of the Varangian Guard, the elite unit of Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors who served as the personal bodyguards of the Byzantine emperors, and one can imagine him standing in the gallery during some long ceremony, perhaps a bit bored as soldiers on ceremonial duty often are, and deciding to leave his mark for posterity in the way that visitors to famous places have done since time immemorial. The building stands today, though it has served different purposes over its long history, and its dome still floats above the nave, still catches the light through those 40 windows, still creates the impression that so astonished visitors 15 centuries ago. The mathematics of Anthemius and Isidore, refined by the younger Isidore after the collapse, proved sound enough to outlast the empire that created them, and the building they designed with their curves and calculations and clever solutions remains one of the most remarkable achievements of human construction, a place where geometry and faith combined to create something that seemed, and perhaps still seems, to transcend the ordinary limitations of brick and mortar and stone. And so we come now to one of the most remarkable and mysterious inventions in all of military history, a weapon so closely guarded that its secrets were eventually lost to time altogether, leaving modern scholars to puzzle over fragments and half-remembered descriptions, piecing together what they can from accounts written by those who witnessed its terrible effectiveness but never understood its inner workings. This weapon, known to history as Greek fire, though the Byzantines themselves called it by many names, including liquid fire, sea fire, and Roman fire, would prove instrumental in preserving the empire during some of its darkest hours. And its story begins in the late 7th century, when Constantinople faced an existential threat from the rapidly expanding Arab caliphates that had already swept through much of the ancient Roman world. The invention of Greek fire is traditionally attributed to a man named Callinicos, sometimes written as Callinicus in Latin sources, who came to Constantinople as a refugee from the city of Heliopolis, which is located in what we now call Lebanon and which the Arabs had recently conquered. Callinicos was of Jewish heritage, and like so many skilled craftsmen and scholars of that era, he fled westward toward the Byzantine capital, bringing with him knowledge of chemistry and combustibles that he had acquired in his homeland, where such traditions of working with petroleum and naphtha had existed for centuries. Around the year 672 CE, give or take a few years depending on which chronicle one consults, Callinicos presented his invention to the Byzantine authorities, and the timing could not have been more fortuitous, for the empire was in desperate need of any advantage it could find against the Arab fleets that were steadily advancing toward the heart of Byzantine power. The first major test of this new weapon came during the Arab siege of Constantinople, which lasted from approximately 674 to 678 CE. A prolonged assault that saw Arab forces establish a base on the peninsula of Cyzicus, from which they launched repeated naval attacks against the city walls during the sailing season each summer. The Arabs had assembled a formidable fleet, confident that their naval superiority would allow them to breach the famous walls of Constantinople from the sea, where the defences were somewhat less imposing than the legendary Theodosian walls that protected the landward approaches. What they encountered instead was something for which no amount of planning or bravery could have prepared them, a fire that seemed to defy the natural order of things, burning not only on the surface of the water but seemingly fed by it, as though the sea itself had become kindling for Byzantine flames. The exact composition of Greek fire remains unknown to this day, which is itself a testament to the extraordinary secrecy with which the Byzantines surrounded their most prized military technology. However, based on various accounts and the informed speculation of historians and chemists over the centuries, we can piece together a rough understanding of what likely went into this fearsome substance. The primary ingredient was almost certainly petroleum-based, probably crude oil or naphtha, which was available from natural seeps in various regions around the Black Sea and the Caucasus, areas over which the Byzantines maintained control or influence. To this base, the Byzantine artificers likely added quicklime, which reacts vigorously with water and generates significant heat, potentially explaining why the fire seemed to burn more intensely when it came into contact with the sea. Sulfur was probably included as well, adding to the intensity and the distinctive, sulfurous smell that witnesses described, and pine resin or pitch may have been incorporated to make the mixture more viscous and to help it adhere to whatever surface it touched, whether wooden ship hulls or the unfortunate sailors trying to escape its reach. What made Greek fire so uniquely terrifying was not merely that it burned with unusual intensity, though it certainly did that, but rather that water, which had been humanity's primary defense against fire since the earliest days of civilization, not only failed to extinguish it but appeared to make it burn more fiercely. Enemy sailors who attempted to douse the flames with seawater, as one naturally would when fire broke out on a ship, found to their horror that their efforts only spread the conflagration further, and those who leapt into the water to escape found themselves surrounded by flames floating on the surface, burning bright and hot even amidst the waves. Some accounts suggest that the only reliable ways to extinguish Greek fire were to smother it with sand, to douse it with vinegar, or perhaps with aged urine, Though in the chaos of a naval battle, such substances were rarely available in sufficient quantities to make any difference. The delivery system for Greek fire was as ingenious as the substance itself. And here the Byzantine engineers demonstrated a mechanical sophistication that would not be equaled in Western Europe for many centuries. The primary method of deployment was through a device called the siphon, which was essentially a bronze or copper pump mechanism mounted in the bow of Byzantine warships called dromons. The dromon was the standard Byzantine warship of this era, a sleek and maneuverable galley propelled by both oars and sail, and the siphon transformed it into something far more dangerous than a mere vessel of war. The exact mechanism of the siphon is not fully understood, but it appears to have worked on the same principle as a force pump, with the operator building up pressure and then releasing it to project a stream of the flaming liquid toward enemy vessels. Some accounts describe a preliminary ignition chamber where the mixture was heated or set alight before being expelled, creating an effect that witnesses compared to a dragon breathing fire. And indeed, the bronze tubes from which the fire emerged were often crafted to resemble the heads of fearsome beasts, adding a psychological dimension to the already terrifying weapon. In addition to the ship-mounted siphon, the Byzantines developed smaller, handheld versions called chirosiphones, which were portable flame-throwing devices that could be used in land battles or in close-quarters combat during boarding actions. These handheld siphons operated on similar principles to their larger cousins, but were compact enough to be carried and operated by a single soldier. The Byzantines also developed what we might consider an early form of grenade, ceramic containers filled with Greek fire that could be thrown by hand or launched from catapults, shattering on impact and spreading their burning contents across decks and sails. These various delivery methods gave Byzantine forces tremendous flexibility in how they could deploy their secret weapon, whether in large naval engagements, in the defense of harbors and ports, or in siege warfare where flames could be directed against enemy siege engines and fortifications. The secrecy surrounding Greek fire was treated with the utmost seriousness at the highest levels of Byzantine government. And this brings us to one of the more fascinating aspects of this story, the quasi-religious ceremony that surrounded the protection of this secret. Byzantine emperors, upon ascending to the throne, participated in a solemn ritual in which they swore sacred oaths never to reveal the formula for Greek fire to any foreign power, under any circumstances whatsoever. The justification given for this extreme secrecy was not merely strategic but theological, for the official position of the imperial court held that the formula had been revealed to Constantine the Great himself by an angel of God, making it a divine gift to the Christian Roman Empire alone. Whether the emperors themselves believed this origin story or simply found it useful for impressing upon everyone the absolute necessity of maintaining the secret, we cannot say with certainty, but the effect was the same. The formula was guarded as if it were holy scripture, known only to a small circle of trusted craftsmen and officials whose discretion was beyond question. The decisive importance of Greek fire was demonstrated most dramatically during the Second Arab Siege of Constantinople, which took place in the years 717 and 718 CE, and which represented perhaps the greatest threat the city had ever faced up to that point in its history. A vast Arab army, estimated by some sources at 120,000 soldiers, though this figure is almost certainly exaggerated, approached the city by land from Thrace, while an enormous fleet of perhaps 1,800 ships, again a number that should be treated with some skepticism, moved to blockade the city from the sea and to cut off its vital supply lines. The commander of this expedition was Maslama ibn Abdul Malik, brother of the Caliph, and the Arab forces were confident that this time they would succeed where their predecessors had failed, that the great city of Constantinople would finally fall and the heart of Christian power in the East would be extinguished. The Byzantine emperor at this time was Leo III, who had risen to power just months before the siege began through a combination of military prowess and political maneuvering during a period of considerable instability. Leo was a capable administrator and a shrewd strategist, and he understood that the survival of his empire depended on his ability to neutralize the Arab naval advantage. On the water, Greek fire proved to be the decisive factor, as Byzantine dromons equipped with siphons wreaked havoc on the Arab fleet, setting ship after ship ablaze in engagements that must have seemed like scenes from some apocalyptic vision to those who witnessed them. The Arab fleet suffered catastrophic losses, not merely in ships destroyed during battle but in the demoralization that spread through their ranks as sailors realized that they faced a weapon against which they had no defense, a fire that could not be fought, could not be escaped, and seemed almost supernatural in its terrible persistence. The accounts left by those who faced Greek fire speak to the profound psychological impact it had on enemy forces, describing scenes of terror and desperation that went far beyond the normal horrors of warfare. Arab chroniclers and later Muslim historians described Byzantine ships as appearing to breathe fire like dragons, their bronze siphons casting forth streams of flame that seemed to writhe and leap across the water with a malevolent will of their own. Soldiers who had faced death countless times in battle, who had conquered vast territories and defeated formidable enemies, found themselves reduced to panic by this weapon that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of nature. Some sources describe sailors refusing to engage Byzantine vessels at all once they learned what awaited them, preferring to face charges of cowardice rather than the burning death that Greek fire promised. The siege of 717 to 718 ended in complete disaster for the Arab forces, with the remnants of their once mighty fleet limping home after suffering losses that would take decades to replace, and with their army devastated as much by the brutal winter and the Bulgarian forces who harassed them from the north as by direct Byzantine military action. Constantinople had survived once again, and Greek fire had proven itself to be worth far more than its weight in gold, a weapon that could turn the tide of battles that might otherwise have been unwinnable, that could preserve an empire against enemies who vastly outnumbered it. The Byzantines would continue to use Greek fire for several more centuries, deploying it against various enemies including the Rus Vikings who attacked Constantinople in the 10th century, and it remained throughout this period the empire's most closely guarded military secret. And yet, despite all the efforts to preserve the formula, despite the sacred oaths and the limited circles of knowledge and the careful control of information, the secret of Greek fire was eventually lost. At some point, probably during the chaotic centuries that followed the Fourth Crusade and the Latin conquest of Constantinople in 1204, the chain of transmission was broken. The last artisans who knew the formula died without passing on their knowledge, and the weapon that had saved an empire passed from reality into legend. Modern chemists have proposed various reconstructions based on the available historical evidence, and some of these recreations can indeed produce substances that burn on water with considerable intensity, but none can be confirmed as the true formula. And Greek fire remains one of history's enduring mysteries, a reminder that some secrets, once lost, cannot be recovered no matter how much we might wish to understand them. And so we come now to a period of profound disagreement within the Byzantine world, a time when the empire turned inward to argue about something that might seem, to our modern sensibilities, rather abstract, and yet which stirred passions so deep that blood was spilled in the streets of Constantinople, and families were divided, and emperors and empresses rose and fell over the question of whether it was permissible, whether it was holy or unholy, to venerate images of Christ and the saints. This period, known as the Iconoclast controversy, stretched across more than a century, from roughly 726 to 843 of the Common Era, and it left scars upon the Byzantine Church and state that never fully healed, while also destroying countless works of art that we shall never see, mosaics scraped from walls, paintings burned, icons smashed to pieces by imperial decree. To understand how such a controversy could arise, we must remember that the Byzantines took their religion with the utmost seriousness, and that questions of correct worship were not merely academic exercises but matters touching upon the salvation of souls and the favor of God toward the empire itself. The use of religious images, what the Greeks called icons, had grown steadily throughout the Christian centuries, and by the 7th and early 8th centuries, icons were everywhere in Byzantine life. They hung in churches and monasteries, of course, but also in private homes, in shops, at crossroads, and above the gates of cities. People kissed them, bowed before them, lit candles and burned incense in their presence, and believed that the saints depicted could intercede on their behalf, that somehow, through the image, one might reach the holy person represented. But there had always been voices, quieter voices perhaps, but persistent ones, who worried that such practices strayed too close to the idolatry that the Hebrew Scriptures had so firmly condemned. The second commandment, after all, had instructed the children of Israel to make no graven image, no likeness of anything in heaven above or earth beneath, and while Christians had developed various ways of interpreting this injunction, the concern never entirely disappeared. Some argued that the incarnation of Christ, God becoming man and taking visible form, had changed everything, that because the divine had entered the material world in human flesh, it was now permissible, even praiseworthy, to depict that flesh in paint and mosaic. Others were not so certain, and in the early 8th century, these doubts found a powerful champion upon the imperial throne. The Emperor Leo III, who reigned from 717 to 741, was a capable military man who had saved Constantinople from a massive Arab siege in the early years of his reign, and who perhaps saw himself as a reformer called to purify the empire and restore divine favor. In 726, Leo issued a decree ordering the destruction of religious icons, beginning what we call the First Iconoclast period. Iconoclast meaning, quite literally, image breaker. The emperor's reasoning seems to have combined several threads of thought. There was the old anxiety about the second commandment, certainly, but there may also have been influence from the growing power of Islam on the empire's borders, for the Muslims rejected religious images with a firmness that some Byzantine thinkers found compelling. There were earthquakes and military setbacks that some interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, and Leo may have come to believe that the empire's troubles stemmed from its embrace of what he considered idolatry. The theological arguments marshaled by the iconoclasts were not without a certain logic, and those who defended the icons, whom we call iconodules or iconophiles, meaning lovers of images, had to work carefully to explain why their veneration did not constitute worship of mere wood and paint. The iconodules argued that the honor paid to an icon passed through the image to the holy person depicted, much as, they said, one might honor a king by bowing before his portrait without imagining that one was worshipping the canvas itself. Icons were windows to heaven, openings through which the divine could be glimpsed, not objects of worship in themselves but aids to devotion, focal points that help the faithful lift their minds from earthly things to heavenly realities. The Incarnation, they insisted, had made all the difference, for if God Himself had chosen to become visible in human form, then surely it was no sin to represent that form in art. But Leo III was not persuaded by such arguments, and his decree set in motion events that would shake the capital itself. One of the most prominent icons in Constantinople was a great image of Christ that hung above the Chalk Gate, the main ceremonial entrance to the imperial palace complex. When imperial soldiers came to remove and destroy this icon, they were met by a crowd of outraged citizens, many of them women, who resisted with such determination that violence ensued. Several of the women were killed in the struggle, becoming, in the eyes of the iconodules, martyrs for the holy images. The incident at the Chalk Gate revealed how deeply the devotion to icons had penetrated Byzantine society, and how dangerous it would be to uproot it by force. The controversy continued through the reign of Leo's son, Constantine V, who ruled from 741 to 775 and who pursued iconoclasm with even greater vigor than his father. Constantine was a capable emperor in many respects, successful in his wars against the Bulgars, but he earned the lasting hatred of the iconodule party, who gave him the unflattering nickname Copronymus, which we need not translate too precisely but which suggests something deeply unclean. Under Constantine, monks who defended the icons were persecuted, monasteries were closed, and the destruction of religious art proceeded with systematic thoroughness. Mosaics were scraped from church walls, icons were burned or thrown into the sea, and centuries of accumulated artistic achievement were lost forever. We shall never know how many masterpieces perished in these decades, how many images that might have given us insight into early Byzantine spirituality and artistic technique were reduced to ashes or scattered fragments. Yet even as emperors in Constantinople decreed the destruction of icons, one of the most eloquent defenders of image veneration was writing from beyond the empire's reach, in the city of Damascus, which was by then under Muslim control. John of Damascus, as he is known, served for a time as a high official in the Umayyad court, and from this position of safety, where no Byzantine emperor could touch him, he composed theological treatises defending the veneration of icons with a clarity and persuasiveness that would influence the debate for generations. John argued that matter itself had been sanctified by the Incarnation, that the material world was not something to be despised or feared but could serve as a vehicle for the sacred. His writings would become foundational texts for the iconodule position, and his feast day is still celebrated in the Eastern Orthodox churches, a reminder of how contributions to the life of the Church can come from unexpected places and unlikely circumstances. The first iconoclast period came to an end, at least temporarily, under the Empress Irene, one of the most remarkable and controversial figures in Byzantine history. Irene had come to Constantinople from Athens as a bride for Leo IV, the son of Constantine V, and when her husband died in 780, she served as regent for her young son, Constantine VI. Irene was sympathetic to the iconodule cause, perhaps due to her own personal piety, perhaps due to political calculation, for the iconoclast policy had made many enemies among the monasteries and among the common people. In 787, she convened a great church council at Nicaea, the same city where Constantine the Great had assembled bishops to address the Arian controversy more than 4 centuries earlier. This council, which we call the Second Council of Nicaea, formally restored the veneration of icons, drawing upon the theological arguments of John of Damascus and others to declare that icons were to be honored, though not with the worship due to God alone. But Irene's story does not end with this triumph of the icons. Her relationship with her son Constantine VI grew increasingly troubled as he came of age and sought to rule in his own right. The details of their conflict are complex and not entirely clear from our sources. But in 797, Irene made a decision of appalling ruthlessness. She had her own son seized and blinded, the injury being inflicted so severely that he died from it, or at the very least was left so damaged that he could no longer rule. Irene then took the throne in her own name, an almost unprecedented step for a woman in the Byzantine world. And she styled herself not empress but emperor, using the masculine title as if to emphasize that she held power in her own right and not merely as a regent or consort. Her reign was troubled and relatively brief, and she was overthrown in 802, dying in exile the following year, but she had left her mark both on the history of the icons and on the history of imperial power itself. The restoration of icons did not prove permanent. In 815, the Emperor Leo V, facing renewed military threats and perhaps influenced by advisors who attributed the empire's troubles to the return of image veneration, reinstituted Iconoclasm, beginning what we call the Second Iconoclast period. This phase was somewhat less violent than the first, but it continued for nearly 3 decades, through the reigns of Leo V and his successors Michael II and Theophilus. Once again, icons were removed from churches, monks and iconodule clergy were harassed, and the empire was divided against itself over a question that must have seemed, to outsiders, almost incomprehensibly abstract, and yet which touched upon the deepest questions of how human beings might relate to the divine, how the material and spiritual realms might be connected, and what forms of worship were pleasing to God. The final resolution came, fittingly enough, under another empress, Theodora, who served as regent for her young son Michael III after the death of her husband Theophilus in 842. Theodora was, like Irene before her, sympathetic to the icons, and in 843, she convened a council that formally and finally restored their veneration, bringing the iconoclast controversy to a close at last. The date was the first Sunday of Lent, and this day is still celebrated in the Eastern Orthodox churches as the Feast of Orthodoxy, or the Triumph of Orthodoxy, a commemoration not only of the restoration of the icons but of the correctness of Orthodox teaching more generally. On this day, icons are processed through churches with particular solemnity, and the names of those who defended the holy images are honored, while those who sought to destroy them are remembered rather less kindly. The legacy of iconoclasm is complex and somewhat melancholy. On the one hand, the ultimate victory of the iconodules shaped the character of Eastern Orthodoxy down to the present day, making icons a central and distinctive feature of Orthodox worship and spirituality. The theological arguments worked out during this controversy clarified how Christians might understand the relationship between the material and the divine, and they remain relevant to discussions of religious art and devotion even now. But on the other hand, the iconoclast decades destroyed an incalculable wealth of early Byzantine art, leaving gaps in our understanding that can never be filled. When we look at the magnificent icons and mosaics that survive from later centuries, we must remember that they represent only what was made after the controversy ended, and that the treasures of the earlier period are largely lost to us, scraped from walls, burned in bonfires, thrown into the sea by soldiers following imperial orders. And so the Byzantine Empire passed through this long night of internal conflict, and emerged, in 843, with the icons restored and the theological questions, at least for the moment, resolved. The emperors had learned, perhaps, that there were limits to what imperial decrees could achieve when they ran against the deep devotions of the people, that the faith of monks and women and ordinary citizens could, in the end, prove stronger than the will of emperors. The Christ image at the chalk gate would be restored, and new icons would be painted, and new mosaics would gleam from the walls of churches rebuilt or redecorated after the storms had passed, and the faithful would continue, as they had before, to light candles and burn incense and kiss the holy images, seeing in them not idols but windows, openings through which the light of heaven might pour into the ordinary world of human devotion. And now we come to a rather remarkable arrangement, one that brought warriors from the cold northern seas to serve beneath the golden domes of Constantinople, where they would stand guard in their heavy mail and carry axes that could cleave through armor and bone alike. These were the Varangians, a name derived from an Old Norse word meaning something like those who have sworn an oath, and their story is one of loyalty purchased through distance, of fierce men who found in the Byzantine court a purpose that suited their particular talents rather well. The formal establishment of what we now call the Varangian Guard is generally dated to around 988 CE, during the reign of the Emperor Basil II, who was at that time facing considerable difficulties with rebellious generals and the ever-present challenge of securing his throne against ambitious rivals. It happened that Vladimir I, the Grand Prince of Kiev, required assistance of a different sort, namely the hand of the emperor's sister Anna in marriage, which would bring with it the considerable prestige of a Byzantine alliance and, not incidentally, the Christian faith that Vladimir would subsequently impose upon his people. The negotiations resulted in an agreement whereby Vladimir would provide military assistance in the form of approximately 6,000 warriors, drawn from the Rus people who were themselves descended from earlier Scandinavian settlers and traders. These men arrived in Constantinople and proved so effective in helping Basil II suppress the rebellion of Bardas Phocas that the emperor decided to retain them as a permanent household unit, answering directly to himself and forming the core of what would become one of the most famous military formations in medieval history. The reasoning behind the emperor's preference for foreign bodyguards reveals a great deal about the Byzantine political system, which was, to put it gently, rather prone to intrigue, assassination, and the occasional palace coup. Native-born Byzantine soldiers, no matter how skilled or seemingly devoted, came with entanglements that could prove awkward or even fatal. They had families in the city, connections to aristocratic factions, loyalties to generals who might themselves harbor imperial ambitions, and relationships with the complex web of eunuchs, courtiers, and officials who populated the great palace. A guardsman who had grown up in the capital might find himself torn between his oath to the reigning emperor and his cousin's involvement in a conspiracy, or his father-in-law's quiet suggestions that perhaps a change of leadership would benefit everyone concerned. The Varangians, by contrast, had no such complications to trouble them. They came from distant lands where the affairs of Byzantine noble houses were simply irrelevant. They had no estates to protect or inheritances to secure through political maneuvering, and their fortunes depended entirely upon the continued survival and favor of whoever currently sat upon the throne. This made them, in the calculation of successive emperors, the most trustworthy guards available, not because they were inherently more virtuous than Byzantine soldiers, but because their self-interest aligned perfectly with protecting the emperor's person. The most distinctive feature of the Varangian Guard, at least to outside observers, was their characteristic weapon, the great two-handed axe known in Greek as the pelikes. These were formidable instruments with broad curved blades mounted on long hafts, quite different from the swords and spears that Byzantine soldiers typically carried, and their presence marked the Varangians out immediately in any crowd. Contemporary accounts describe these axes as being capable of cutting through horse and rider together, which may be somewhat exaggerated but conveys the impression they made upon those who witnessed them in action. The Varangians also carried swords and wore heavy mail armor, and they were known for their height and physical strength, qualities that the Byzantines found both impressive and somewhat alarming. When the emperor appeared in public processions or sat in audience in the throne room, the Varangians would be positioned nearby, their axes resting upon their shoulders or held upright beside them, a visible reminder that any would-be assassin would need to get past these large and notably loyal northerners before reaching their target. Their reputation extended beyond mere martial prowess, however, for the Varangians were also celebrated, or perhaps notorious, for their drinking. The Byzantines, who were generally a moderate people when it came to alcohol, found the northern custom of consuming vast quantities of wine and mead rather remarkable, and numerous accounts mention the Varangians' fondness for intoxication during their off-duty hours. They were sometimes referred to, not entirely unkindly, as the emperor's winebags, a term that captured both their usefulness and their particular habits. This drinking culture appears to have been tolerated by their employers, who perhaps understood that warriors far from home required some form of recreation, and the Varangians seem to have maintained their effectiveness in battle despite their enthusiasm for the grape. One must imagine that the taverns near the barracks where the guard was housed did rather good business, and that the neighborhood grew accustomed to the sounds of northern songs sung in languages that few Constantinopolitans could understand. Among the many warriors who served in the Varangian Guard over the centuries, perhaps the most famous is Harold Searson, known to history as Harold Hardrada, a name meaning roughly Harold the Hard Ruler, which gives some indication of his character. Harold arrived in Constantinople around 1034 CE as a young man of about 19 years, having fled Norway following his half-brother King Olaf II's defeat and death at the Battle of Stiklestad. He came seeking fortune and perhaps also the military experience that would serve him well should he ever attempt to reclaim his family's position in Norway, and Constantinople offered both in abundance. The Byzantine Empire at this time was engaged in numerous campaigns across multiple frontiers, and Harold participated in military expeditions in Sicily, Bulgaria, and the Holy Land, distinguishing himself sufficiently to rise to a position of considerable authority within the Guard. His service coincided with a particularly turbulent period in Byzantine politics, and in 1042 CE Harold found himself caught up in events that would have significant consequences. The Emperor Michael V, who had risen to power through the adoption and favor of the Empress Zoe, made the rather unwise decision to exile his benefactress and seize sole control of the government. This provoked an uprising among the people of Constantinople, who were genuinely devoted to Zoe and her sister Theodora as members of the legitimate Macedonian dynasty, and mobs filled the streets demanding Michael's removal. The Varangian Guard, perhaps influenced by Harold's leadership or perhaps simply recognizing which way the political winds were blowing, chose to support the popular uprising rather than defend the increasingly isolated emperor. Michael V was captured and, according to custom in such cases, blinded to render him incapable of ruling again, a fate that various sources suggest Harold may have personally administered or at least witnessed. The blinding of emperors was a Byzantine practice that avoided the sin of killing an anointed ruler while still permanently removing them from political contention, and it was considered, in the logic of the time, a merciful alternative to execution. Throughout his years of service, Harold accumulated considerable wealth through his share of plunder, payments, and various other means that the sources describe with varying degrees of specificity. Byzantine military campaigns often resulted in substantial booty, and successful commanders were entitled to significant portions of whatever was seized. By the time Harold decided to leave Constantinople, probably in 1042 CE following the change in emperors, he had amassed sufficient gold and precious objects to finance his subsequent career in Scandinavia. His departure was apparently not entirely sanctioned by the imperial authorities, and later saga accounts describe a dramatic escape by ship through the chain that blocked the Golden Horn, though one must always treat such stories with appropriate caution given their composition many years after the events they describe. What is certain is that Harold made his way back to Scandinavia, married Elizabeth, daughter of Yaroslav the Wise of Kiev, and eventually secured the throne of Norway in 1046 CE after the death of his nephew Magnus. Harold's subsequent career as King of Norway is a story in itself, but we might note briefly that his Byzantine experience shaped both his ambitions and his methods of rule. He attempted to conquer Denmark and engaged in various campaigns that demonstrated both his military abilities and his ruthlessness, fully justifying his nickname. His final adventure took him across the North Sea in 1066 CE, that remarkable year which saw 3 different kings ruling England in succession. Harold invaded with a large Norwegian force, won an initial victory at Fulford, but was then caught by surprise when King Harold Godwinson of England force-marched his army north with unexpected speed. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September, 1066, Harold Hardrada was killed, struck in the throat by an arrow according to tradition, and his dreams of adding England to his realm died with him. Just 19 days later, Harold Godwinson himself would fall at Hastings, and the Norman conquest would begin a new chapter in English history. That conquest brings us to another curious chapter in the history of the Varangian Guard, for among its consequences was the displacement of the Anglo-Saxon warrior aristocracy who had formed the backbone of the English military system. These men, finding themselves dispossessed of their lands and positions under the new Norman regime, looked for opportunities elsewhere, and many of them eventually made their way to Constantinople to offer their services to the emperor. The Byzantine court was apparently quite pleased to receive them, for the English had a considerable martial reputation, and they supplemented the existing Scandinavian element in the Guard. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the Varangian Guard had become notably English in composition, to the point where Greek sources sometimes refer to them simply as the English, and their presence in Constantinople represents a strange coda to the Norman conquest, Anglo-Saxon warriors serving a Greek-speaking emperor in a city founded by Romans. There exist physical traces of the Varangians' presence that have survived the centuries and that one may still, with some effort, observe today. Perhaps the most famous is the great marble lion that once stood at the entrance to the harbour of Piraeus, near Athens, and that now resides in Venice, having been carried off as loot by Venetian forces in 1687 CE. This lion, which dates from ancient times and likely commemorated some Athenian victory, bears on its shoulders and sides runic inscriptions that were carved by Varangian warriors, probably during the 11th century. The inscriptions are badly weathered and extremely difficult to read, but they appear to be memorial texts of the sort commonly found on runestones throughout Scandinavia, commemorating warriors who had served and perhaps died in Byzantine service. That these northern soldiers would carve their names and memorials on an ancient Greek statue speaks to the remarkable cultural mixing that Constantinople facilitated. Men from the fjords of Norway or the fields of Sweden standing before a lion that had witnessed centuries of Greek history and adding their own marks to its surface. Even more evocative, perhaps, is the graffiti that can be found inside the great church of Hagia Sophia itself. Scratched into the marble railings of the upper gallery, where guards might have stood during long religious services, are runic inscriptions that visitors with sharp eyes and some knowledge of where to look can still discern. One inscription, partially legible, appears to read something like Halfdan carved these runes, the simple statement of a bored or pious guardsman who felt moved to leave his mark in this most sacred of Byzantine spaces. These scratched letters, made by a hand that has been dust for 1,000 years, connect us directly to the individual Varangians who stood watch in the great church, who listened to the chanting of the Byzantine liturgy without understanding a word, and who perhaps felt, in that overwhelming space of gold and marble, that they ought to leave some trace of their presence for those who might come after. The Varangian Guard continued to exist for several more centuries, though its character changed over time as the Byzantine Empire itself contracted and its resources diminished. The privilege of palace pillaging, which allowed the guardsmen to take whatever they could carry from the imperial treasury upon the death of an emperor, was maintained as an incentive for loyal service, a remarkable custom that ensured the Varangians had a personal stake in seeing each emperor safely to his natural end rather than hastening his departure. When an emperor died, the guardsmen would enter the treasury and take gold, silver, jewels, and whatever else they could physically remove, a practice that must have resulted in some rather undignified scenes but that served as a form of accumulated life insurance, payable upon the conclusion of a reign they had successfully protected. It was a practical arrangement that suited the Byzantine fondness for clearly defined incentives, and it appears to have worked well enough that successive emperors continued to honor it. And so we arrive at a rather fascinating subject, though fascinating in the quietest possible way, which is the manner in which the Byzantine Empire conducted its dealings with foreign powers, a practice they elevated to something very nearly resembling an art form, though perhaps craft is the better word, since it involved such careful attention to detail and such elaborate preparation and such patient accumulation of knowledge about the wider world beyond their borders. The Byzantines understood, you see, that power could be projected not merely through armies and navies, impressive though theirs certainly were, but also through the careful cultivation of an image, an atmosphere of overwhelming majesty and otherworldly sophistication that would leave visitors from distant lands feeling rather small and perhaps a little uncertain about their own standing in the grand arrangement of civilization. This was not accidental, not at all, but rather the result of deliberate planning and considerable expense and generations of accumulated wisdom about how to make an impression upon the minds of foreign ambassadors and princes and kings who came to Constantinople seeking treaties or trade agreements or simply wishing to take the measure of this ancient empire that sat at the crossroads of the world. The centerpiece of this careful stagecraft was the Magnora, which was one of the great audience halls within the sprawling palace complex, and it was here that the most important diplomatic receptions took place, in a setting designed to overwhelm the senses and suggest that the Emperor of the Romans was something rather more than an ordinary mortal ruler. The hall itself was imposing enough, with its columns and its mosaics and its sheer scale. But what made it truly remarkable were the mechanical wonders that the Byzantine craftsmen had installed there, Devices powered by hidden mechanisms and designed to astonish visitors who had never seen anything quite like them and likely never would again. There was, most famously, a great golden tree that stood near the throne, its branches filled with birds crafted from precious metals. And these birds, through some ingenious arrangement of bellows and pipes, would sing, producing sounds that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, as though the very room were alive with birdsong. Flanking the throne itself were lions made of bronze, or perhaps gilded bronze. The accounts vary somewhat, and these too were mechanical, capable of opening their great jaws and producing roaring sounds that would startle anyone unprepared for such a display. The throne itself, upon which the emperor sat in robes of purple and gold, was perhaps the most remarkable device of all, for it could rise, smoothly and silently, carried upward toward the ceiling by hidden machinery while visitors prostrated themselves upon the floor according to the strict requirements of court protocol. We know of these wonders in some detail because of an account left to us by Liutprand of Cremona, who was an Italian diplomat, a bishop actually, who visited Constantinople in 949 of the Common Era as an envoy from Berengar II of Italy. Liutprand was a well-educated man, familiar with courts and ceremonies and not easily impressed, but what he saw in the Magnaura clearly stayed with him for the rest of his life. He described being led into the great hall and performing the proskynesis, which was the ritual prostration required of all who entered the imperial presence, and when he rose from the floor and looked toward the throne, he found that the emperor, who had been seated at a normal height when he entered, had somehow ascended to a position far above, near the ceiling, wearing entirely different robes than he had worn moments before. The mechanical lions, Liutprand tells us, beat the ground with their tails and roared, while the golden birds in the golden tree sang their metallic songs, and the overall effect was precisely what the Byzantines had intended, which was to suggest that this emperor, this ruler of the Romans, possessed powers and resources beyond the understanding of ordinary kingdoms. Liutprand was no fool, and he understood that machinery of some kind must be responsible for these marvels. But understanding that something is a trick and being unaffected by it are two rather different things, and the sheer audacity and expense of the display made its point regardless. The Byzantines had wealth enough and skill enough to create mechanical wonders for no other purpose than to impress visitors, and that in itself was a message worth conveying. The court that surrounded the emperor was organized according to an elaborate hierarchy of titles, each one carefully graded in relation to all the others, and the proper observance of this hierarchy was a matter of the utmost seriousness. At the very top, just below the emperor himself, was the title of Caesar, which had ancient Roman origins, and this was typically reserved for the heir apparent or for members of the imperial family of the highest standing. Below this were other exalted titles such as Sebastocrator, which was introduced in the 11th century and ranked just below Caesar, and below that were further gradations such as Proto-Sebastos and Sebastos and Panhypersebastos, each one conferring particular privileges and particular responsibilities and, importantly, a particular place in the order of precedence at court ceremonies. To address someone by an incorrect title, or to seat them in the wrong position at a banquet, or to fail to observe any of the countless small details of protocol, was not merely a social error but a potential diplomatic incident. Foreign ambassadors were expected to learn these things, or to have advisors who had learned them, and the Byzantines maintained extensive records about the proper forms of address for foreign rulers and the appropriate gifts to give them and the correct way to receive their envoys. An insult to a visiting dignitary, even an unintentional one, could sour relations between empires, and so enormous care was taken to ensure that such insults did not occur, unless of course they were intended, in which case they were delivered with precision and deniability. Among the most significant concepts in Byzantine imperial ideology was that of porphyrogenitos, which translates roughly as born in the purple, and this referred specifically to children who were born in a particular chamber within the palace, a room whose walls were lined with porphyry, which was a purple stone quarried exclusively in Egypt. The purple color had been associated with imperial authority since Roman times, partly because the dye required to produce purple cloth was extraordinarily expensive, and so a child born in the purple chamber was marked out from birth as possessing a special legitimacy that no amount of later elevation could quite match. To be porphyrogenitos was to have been born into the imperial purple, literally surrounded by it at the moment of one's entry into the world, and this status was carefully recorded and invoked when questions of succession arose. One of the most famous individuals to bear this designation was Anna Porphyrogenita, who was a daughter of the Emperor Romanos II and who was indeed born in that purple chamber in the middle of the 10th century. Her marriage, which took place in 988 of the Common Era, was one of the most consequential diplomatic unions in medieval history, for she was given as wife to Vladimir I of Kiev, the ruler of the Kievan Rus, in exchange for military assistance and his agreement to accept Christian baptism. This marriage brought Byzantine Christianity to the Eastern Slavic peoples, establishing the religious and cultural orientation that would shape Russia and Ukraine and Belarus for 1,000 years and more. And it began with a princess born in a purple room and a barbarian prince who wanted very much to be connected to the prestige of Constantinople. Vladimir's baptism and his marriage to Anna Porphyrogenita were understood by both sides as a profound elevation for the Rus ruler, a recognition of his legitimacy by the most ancient and prestigious Christian empire in the world, and the Byzantine cultural influence that flowed northward through this connection included not merely religion but also art and architecture and literature and law. The great cathedrals of Kiev were built in the Byzantine style, filled with mosaics and icons that followed Byzantine conventions, and the Cyrillic alphabet used to this day across much of Eastern Europe was developed by Byzantine missionaries. All of this can be traced, in part, to a diplomatic marriage arranged in the 10th century, and the Byzantines arranged many such marriages over the centuries, spreading their influence across Europe and beyond through the careful distribution of princesses and the equally careful withholding of princesses when circumstances did not favor such generosity. The Byzantine approach to diplomacy was supported by an intelligence apparatus that foreign visitors sometimes found rather unsettling, for the empire maintained what might be called a bureau of barbarians, though the exact name varied over time. And this bureau was responsible for gathering information about foreign peoples and their rulers and their customs and their military capabilities. When an ambassador arrived in Constantinople, the Byzantines often knew a great deal about him already, about his own background and his political standing in his homeland and the disputes within his ruler's court and the likely objectives of his mission. This knowledge was power, obviously, and the Byzantines used it to negotiate from a position of advantage, anticipating demands before they were made and preparing responses that addressed concerns the ambassador had not yet voiced. The gathering of such intelligence was a continuous process, fed by merchants and missionaries and earlier diplomatic missions and defectors and the simple observation of travelers passing through the empire's extensive territories. The Bureau of Barbarians, if we may call it that for convenience, maintained archives of this information, building up over generations a picture of the surrounding world that no other medieval state could match. when a new people appeared on the empire's borders. As new peoples so often did during the long centuries of Byzantine history, the bureaucrats in Constantinople would begin the patient work of learning about them, their language and their leaders and their gods and their weaknesses, so that when the time came for negotiation or confrontation, the emperor and his advisors would not be operating in ignorance. The Byzantines also had a rather distinctive approach to dealing with internal rivals and defeated enemies, one that might seem peculiar to modern sensibilities but which made a certain kind of sense within their political culture. Rather than executing rivals outright, which could create martyrs and provoke vendettas, they frequently chose instead to blind them, a practice that removed them from the possibility of ruling, since an emperor was expected to be physically whole and unblemished, while allowing them to continue living. A blinded prince or general or rebel could retire to a monastery, could even be treated with a certain honor, but could never again seek the throne, and his supporters would find it difficult to rally around a cause that was so visibly defeated. This practice strikes us today as cruel, and it certainly was that. But it was also in its way a form of mercy compared to the alternatives, and it reflected a particular understanding of what made someone fit to rule. The body of the emperor was understood to be in some sense sacred, a reflection of divine order, and so to mutilate that body was to render it unfit for the sacred office, not through any legal prohibition but through deep cultural assumption. Many rivals were blinded, many members of defeated factions, and the practice continued for centuries, a distinctive feature of Byzantine political life that shocked some foreign observers while others simply noted it as one of the peculiar customs of this ancient empire. Among the most carefully guarded assets of the Byzantine economy was the production of silk, which the empire controlled through both technical knowledge and legal restriction. For centuries, the method of producing silk had been a closely held secret of China, and the precious fabric reached the Mediterranean only through long and expensive trade routes. But in 552 of the Common Era, according to the account of the historian Procopius, 2 monks arrived in Constantinople bearing silkworm eggs that they had smuggled out of China concealed within hollow canes, the sort used as walking sticks. These eggs, along with the knowledge of how to cultivate silkworms and harvest their cocoons, allowed the Byzantines to establish their own silk industry, which they thereafter guarded with considerable jealousy. The finest silks, particularly those dyed in the imperial purple, were restricted by law, forbidden from export and reserved for use by the emperor and his court and such persons as he chose to favor with gifts. The purple dye itself, derived from the murex sea snail, was also controlled, and there were severe penalties for anyone caught attempting to smuggle either the dye or the finished purple cloth out of the empire. When the emperor chose to give a gift of purple silk to a foreign ruler, it was understood as a mark of the highest favor, a sharing of something precious and restricted, and such gifts were remembered and treasured and sometimes became relics in their own right, passed down through royal houses as proof of ancient connection to the glory of Constantinople. The diplomatic marriages continued across the centuries, and the daughters and nieces and cousins of emperors found themselves sent to distant courts, carrying with them their dowries and their attendants and their faith and their culture. Byzantine princesses married into the royal houses of the Franks and the Bulgars and the Rus and the Normans and many others, and each marriage was a thread connecting that foreign court to Constantinople, a channel through which influence might flow and alliances might be maintained. The children of these marriages were half Byzantine, raised with some knowledge of their mother's traditions, and sometimes those children or their descendants would seek to strengthen ties with the empire, drawn by the prestige of their heritage. And so the Byzantine Empire maintained its position in the world not merely through the strength of its walls or the skill of its generals, but through this elaborate and patient cultivation of an image. An aura of ancient authority and incomparable sophistication that could impress and intimidate and attract all at once. The mechanical throne that rose toward the ceiling. The golden birds that sang in their golden tree. The bronze lions that roared at the command of hidden engineers. These were all part of a carefully constructed performance, and the performance itself was a form of power, as real in its way as any army. The Fourth Crusade began, as so many tragedies do, with what seemed at the time to be a reasonable plan. A straightforward intention that would only later reveal itself to have been hopelessly naive about the forces it would set into motion. In the year 1198, Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade, the fourth such expedition to be launched by the Christian West toward the Holy Land. And this time the strategy was to be different, for instead of marching overland through Anatolia as previous crusaders had done, the armies would sail directly to Egypt, striking at the heart of Muslim power in the region, and from there they would sweep northward to reclaim Jerusalem. It was a sensible plan on parchment, and the knights and nobles who took the cross believed themselves to be embarking on a holy mission blessed by God and directed toward the liberation of sacred places from Muslim control. None of them could have imagined that their crusade would never reach Egypt, never threaten Muslim lands at all, and would instead culminate in the utter destruction of the greatest Christian city on earth by Christian hands. The troubles began almost immediately with the question of transportation, for a crusading army required ships, and the only power in the Mediterranean capable of providing a fleet of sufficient size was the Republic of Venice, that shrewd maritime state whose galleys and merchant vessels dominated the sea lanes from the Adriatic to the Levant. The Crusade's leaders negotiated a contract with Venice in the year 1201. Agreeing to pay the enormous sum of 85,000 silver marks in exchange for transport ships, horse carriers, and warships, along with provisions for 1 year and the participation of 50 Venetian war galleys. It was an extraordinarily ambitious agreement, predicated on the assumption that some 33,000 crusaders would arrive in Venice ready to embark, and the Venetians, never ones to do things by half measures, set aside all other work to construct this massive fleet. The entire resources of the shipyards were dedicated to the task, and by the agreed-upon date, the ships were ready and waiting in the lagoon. But the Crusaders did not come in the numbers expected, and this shortfall in personnel translated directly into a shortfall in funds. For payment was calculated per head, and by the summer of 1202, only about 11,000 crusaders had actually assembled in Venice, leaving the army desperately short of the money it owed. The Venetians had invested everything in this fleet, halting their regular commerce for more than a year, and they were not inclined to simply forgive the debt or allow the crusaders to depart without settling accounts. The army found itself stranded on the Lido, that sandy barrier island outside Venice proper, unable to pay what it owed and unable to leave without Venetian ships. It was in this moment of crisis that the figure who would do more than any other to shape the course of events made his influence felt, and his name was Enrico Dandolo, Doge of Venice. Dandolo was, by any measure, a remarkable man, well over 90 years old and completely blind, yet possessed of a fierce intelligence, an implacable will, and a memory of grievances stretching back decades. The cause of his blindness was disputed even in his own time, with some accounts suggesting it resulted from an injury sustained in Constantinople during an earlier diplomatic mission, when he had been treated, as he saw it, with contempt and dishonesty by the Byzantine court. Whether this personal grievance truly burned within him or whether he was motivated purely by Venetian commercial interests, the outcome would be the same. For Dandolo saw in the Crusaders' predicament an opportunity to advance Venetian power in the Eastern Mediterranean, and he was willing to guide events toward that end with patient, calculated manipulation. He proposed a solution to the Crusaders' financial difficulties, a way they might work off their debt, and it involved the city of Zara. Zara was a Christian city on the Dalmatian coast, a former Venetian possession that had placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary, himself a Catholic monarch who had taken the cross. To attack Zara was to attack fellow Christians, to assault a city belonging to a brother crusader, and Pope Innocent III expressly forbade it, threatening excommunication for any who participated. But the Crusaders were desperate, trapped by their debts, and in November of 1202 the fleet sailed to Zara and besieged it despite the protests of some among their number and despite the horrified objections of the Pope. The city fell after a short siege, and the Crusaders wintered there, excommunicated by the very Pope who had called their crusade into being, their holy mission already hopelessly compromised before they had even set sail for Muslim lands. It was during this winter in Zara that a new temptation presented itself, an offer that seemed to solve all their problems while leading them even further from their original purpose. A young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos arrived in the camp, the son of the deposed and blinded Emperor Isaac II, and he came bearing promises of unimaginable generosity in exchange for Crusader assistance in reclaiming his father's throne. If the Crusaders would divert to Constantinople and restore his family to power, young Alexios promised he would pay them 200,000 silver marks, provide 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for the Egyptian campaign, supply provisions for the entire army, maintain a permanent garrison of 500 knights in the Holy Land, and most importantly, submit the Orthodox Church to the authority of Rome, healing the schism that had divided Christendom for a century and a half. It was an extraordinary offer, almost certainly impossible for any Byzantine emperor to fulfill, but to the debt-ridden, excommunicated Crusaders it must have seemed like divine providence, a chance to resolve all their difficulties while still serving the cause of Christian unity. Doge Dandolo supported the diversion enthusiastically, for Venice had long sought greater influence in Constantinople and control over Byzantine trade, and in June of 1203 the Fourth Crusade arrived before the walls of the great city, ostensibly to restore the rightful emperor but in reality set upon a course that would lead to catastrophe. The initial assault succeeded more easily than anyone had expected, for the reigning emperor fled the city at the first serious attack, and the blind Isaac II was released from his dungeon and restored to the throne alongside his son, now co-emperor as Alexios IV. For a brief moment it seemed that everything might work out according to plan, that the promised payments would be made, the promised reunification of the churches achieved, and the crusade could continue on its way to Egypt with Byzantine support. But Alexios IV had promised what no emperor could deliver, and as the months passed, it became increasingly clear that he could neither pay the enormous sums he had pledged nor force the Orthodox clergy to submit to Rome. The Byzantine population grew hostile to the foreign soldiers camped outside their walls. The treasury was empty despite Alexios's desperate measures to raise funds, and in January of 1204 a palace coup overthrew both Isaac II and Alexios IV, installing a new emperor named Alexios V. Ducas, called Mort Soufflos for his thick, joined eyebrows. The new emperor had the young Alexios IV strangled, repudiated all agreements with the Crusaders, and prepared to defend Constantinople against what everyone now understood would be an inevitable assault. The Crusaders and Venetians, having been promised vast sums they would never receive, having wintered outside Constantinople at great expense, having come so far from their original purpose, now determined to take by force what they had been denied by diplomacy. In March of 1204 they concluded a formal treaty among themselves, the Partitio Romaniae, dividing in advance the lands and treasures of the Byzantine Empire among the conquerors, with Venice claiming the lion's share of commercial privileges and strategic territories. On the 9th of April they launched their assault, and after a failed first attempt, on the 12th of April they breached the walls and poured into the city. What followed was one of the most shameful episodes in the history of Christendom, a 3-day orgy of violence, looting, and desecration that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to the brutalities of medieval warfare. The Crusaders had been told they could plunder freely for 3 days before bringing their loot to designated collection points for division, and they interpreted this license as permission to commit atrocities beyond imagining. Nuns were raped in their convents, priests were murdered at their altars, the ancient and sacred vessels of the Orthodox liturgy were smashed or stolen, and the accumulated treasures of 8 centuries of Christian civilization were carried off or destroyed. A prostitute was placed upon the throne of the Patriarch in Hagia Sophia itself, that supreme monument of Christian architecture, where she sang bawdy songs and mocked the Orthodox faith while drunken soldiers hacked apart the silver iconostasis and loaded mules with sacred relics. The Byzantine chronicler Nicetas Choniates, who witnessed the sack and whose history preserves the memory of those terrible days, recorded the horrors in anguished detail, noting that even the Saracens would have been more merciful than these soldiers of Christ who claimed to fight in his name. The Muslims, he wrote, had at least honored their treaties and protected the lives of those who surrendered, whereas these Western Christians, these brothers in faith, had shown no restraint, no honor, no Christian charity whatsoever. The wound of this observation has never entirely healed, for it expressed a truth that the Orthodox world would remember for centuries, that when Constantinople truly needed defenders, the Latin West had sent not protectors but destroyers. Among the treasures stolen during the sack were objects of incalculable artistic and spiritual value, many of which remain in Western collections to this day. The 4 magnificent bronze horses that had adorned the hippodrome, ancient works of such beauty that their origin was disputed even then, were carried off to Venice and installed above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica, where copies still stand today while the originals are preserved inside the cathedral. Countless relics of saints, fragments of the true cross, the crown of thorns, the head of St. John the Baptist, and hundreds of other sacred objects were distributed among churches throughout Western Europe, where they became the foundations of new devotional cults. The Mandalion, that miraculous image of Christ said to have been created when Jesus pressed a cloth to his face and left his features imprinted upon it, disappeared during the chaos, its fate unknown, though some believe it to be the same object now known as the Shroud of Turin. In the aftermath of the sack, the conquerors established what they called the Latin Empire of Constantinople, electing Baldwin, Count of Flanders, as the first Latin emperor and dividing Byzantine territories among themselves according to their earlier treaty. But this Latin empire was a fragile thing, never commanding the loyalty of the Greek population, never possessing the resources or the legitimacy of the state it had replaced. Byzantine successor states emerged almost immediately, at Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia under Theodore Lascaris, at Trebizond on the Black Sea coast under the Komnenos family, and at Epirus in northwestern Greece under Michael Komnenos Doukas. These fragments of the old empire carried on Byzantine traditions, preserved the Orthodox faith, and waited for the opportunity to reclaim Constantinople. That opportunity would come in 1261, when Michael VIII Palaiologos of Nicaea would retake the city and restore the Byzantine Empire, but it would be a restoration in name more than in substance, for the empire that emerged from the Latin occupation was a shadow of its former self, stripped of its treasures, its population reduced, its territories diminished, its economic and military power broken beyond recovery. The Fourth Crusade had accomplished what centuries of Persian, Arab, and Turkish attacks had failed to achieve: the mortal wounding of Byzantine civilization. And though the patient would linger for another 2.5 centuries, it would never truly recover from the blow. The memory of 1204 poisoned relations between Eastern and Western Christianity in ways that persist to the present day. For the Orthodox world never forgot or forgave what the Crusaders had done, and every subsequent attempt at reunion between the churches was haunted by that memory. When Byzantine emperors in later centuries sought Western aid against the advancing Ottoman Turks, they found their own people resistant to any alliance that might mean submission to Rome, preferring, as one famous saying had it, the Sultan's turban to the cardinal's hat. This preference was not mere stubborn pride but the accumulated bitterness of generations, the knowledge that those who claimed to share their faith had once proved themselves worse enemies than any infidel. And so the Fourth Crusade, which had set out to strengthen Christendom against its Muslim rivals, ended by weakening it catastrophically, by creating divisions that would never be healed, by ensuring that when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, it would fall without meaningful Western assistance, the Orthodox world having learned through bitter experience that the West could not be trusted. The blind old Doge Enrico Dandolo died in Constantinople in 1205, a year after the sack, and was buried in Hagia Sophia itself, in the gallery above the nave, where his tomb remained until the Ottoman conquest, a permanent reminder of Venetian triumph and Orthodox humiliation, of the day when Christians sacked Christendom. Among the many quiet achievements of the Byzantine Empire, perhaps none has touched our world more profoundly than the patient, methodical work of preserving ancient wisdom across 1,000 years of history. While other civilizations rose and fell around them, and while their own empire weathered countless storms of invasion, political upheaval, and economic hardship, Byzantine scholars continued their gentle labor of copying, studying, and transmitting the intellectual heritage of Greece and Rome to future generations. This was not glamorous work, and it rarely features in the dramatic narratives of history, but it was work of immeasurable importance, carried out in scriptoriums and libraries and lecture halls, by monks and teachers and emperors alike, each generation passing the torch of knowledge to the next with careful, deliberate hands. At the heart of this great enterprise stood the Imperial Library of Constantinople, an institution that grew over the centuries into one of the largest repositories of knowledge the ancient and medieval world had ever seen. At its peak, this remarkable collection held approximately 120,000 volumes, a number that would have been almost unimaginable to scholars in Western Europe during the same period, when even the finest monasteries might possess only a few hundred manuscripts. The library's holdings encompassed works from across the entire span of Greek and Roman civilization, from the earliest philosophers and poets to the scientific treatises of the Hellenistic age, from histories and biographies to medical texts and mathematical proofs. Books that might otherwise have been lost forever, as so many works of antiquity were lost, found shelter within its walls and within the broader scholarly culture that sustained it. The institutional foundations for this preservation were laid remarkably early in Byzantine history, most notably with the establishment of the University of Constantinople in the year 425 of the Common Era, during the reign of Emperor Theodosius II. This institution, sometimes called the Pandidactyrion, was organized to provide instruction in both Greek and Latin, with designated chairs for grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and law. The university created a stable environment in which learning could flourish, where texts could be studied and discussed and copied, where young people could be trained in the scholarly arts that would allow them to continue this work in their own time. It was not the only center of learning in the empire, for schools and academies existed in other cities as well, but it served as a model and a standard, demonstrating the value that Byzantine society placed on education and intellectual continuity. Much of the actual labor of manuscript copying fell to monks working in the scriptoriums of monasteries scattered throughout the empire, in Constantinople itself and in the provinces, on Mount Athos and in Asia Minor and wherever the Orthodox faith had established its quiet communities. These monks approached their work as a form of devotion, a sacred duty performed in silence and concentration, often by candlelight or the pale illumination of narrow windows. They sat for hours at their writing desks, carefully reproducing letter by letter the texts that had been entrusted to them, checking their work against the originals, binding the finished pages into codices that might survive for centuries. The physical demands of this work were considerable, and the intellectual demands were no less significant, for a copyist needed to understand what he was transcribing in order to catch and correct the small errors that inevitably crept into any handwritten text over time. Through these combined efforts of imperial libraries, university scholars, and monastic copyists, an extraordinary range of classical knowledge survived the long centuries when much of this learning had been forgotten or neglected elsewhere. The dialogues of Plato, those foundational texts of Western philosophy in which Socrates discusses truth and beauty, justice and the nature of the soul, knowledge and the ideal state, were preserved in Byzantine copies that would later form the basis for Renaissance editions and modern translations. The works of Aristotle, encompassing logic and metaphysics, ethics and politics, natural philosophy and poetics, remained available to Byzantine scholars who studied and commented upon them, maintaining a continuous tradition of Aristotelian thought that would later flow back into Western Europe through various channels. The mathematical and mechanical treatises of Archimedes, including his investigations of spirals and spheres and the principles of leverage, survived in Byzantine manuscripts, some of which would not be rediscovered and fully appreciated until modern times. The medical knowledge of the ancient world found particularly careful preservation in Byzantium, where the practical value of such learning was readily apparent and where a tradition of medical education and practice continued throughout the medieval period. The extensive writings of Galen, the second-century physician whose theories would dominate medical thinking for over a millennium, were copied and recopied, studied and taught, their complex accounts of anatomy and physiology and therapeutics remaining available to each new generation of Byzantine doctors. Other Greek medical writers, including Hippocrates and Dioscorides and Oribasius, were similarly preserved, creating a comprehensive library of ancient medical wisdom that Byzantine practitioners could draw upon in their own work and that would eventually inform the development of medicine in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. Among the most remarkable individual contributions to this preservation effort was the work of Patriarch Photios I, one of the most learned men of the 9th century and a towering figure in Byzantine intellectual history. Photios compiled a work known as the Bibliotheca, sometimes called the Myriabiblon, in which he provided summaries and critical assessments of approximately 280 books that he had read. This compilation is of extraordinary value to modern scholars because many of the works Photios described are now lost, surviving only in his careful summaries and quotations. Through the Bibliotheca, we know of histories and novels, theological treatises, and scientific works that would otherwise have vanished entirely from human memory. Photios wrote with intelligence and discernment, offering his own evaluations of style and content, creating not merely a catalogue but a genuine work of literary criticism that gives us insight into the reading habits and intellectual standards of educated Byzantines. The 9th century saw a broader revival of classical learning, often associated with the figure of Leo the mathematician, a scholar and teacher whose reputation for learning spread far beyond the borders of the Byzantine Empire. Leo is credited with reorganizing education in Constantinople, establishing schools and training a new generation of scholars who would carry forward the work of preservation and study. He gathered students around him and taught them the ancient disciplines, mathematics and philosophy and astronomy, ensuring that knowledge which might have been lost was instead passed on and renewed. Leo is also credited with a rather different sort of achievement, the reported invention or at least significant improvement of a system of optical telegraph signals using fire beacons positioned across Anatolia, capable of transmitting warnings of Arab raids from the frontier to the capital with remarkable speed. This ingenious system, if the accounts of it are accurate, demonstrates the practical application of scientific and mathematical knowledge in Byzantine society, the translation of theoretical understanding into technologies that served real defensive needs. The 10th century brought what historians often call the Macedonian Renaissance, a period of particularly intense cultural and intellectual activity during the rule of the Macedonian dynasty. The emperors of this period were themselves often learned men who took personal interest in scholarly projects, and their patronage created favorable conditions for an extraordinary flourishing of Byzantine letters and learning. No figure better represents this imperial involvement in scholarship than Emperor Constantine's 7 Porphyrogenitos, who reigned in the middle of the 10th century and who personally directed major compilations of knowledge on an impressive range of subjects. Constantine oversaw the creation of encyclopedic works covering ceremonial and protocol, military tactics and strategy, the administration of the empire, and the governance of foreign peoples. His work on the themes of the empire and his treatise on the administration of the empire remain valuable sources for historians today, and his patronage extended to compilations of agricultural knowledge, of excerpts from classical historians, and of various other useful and interesting information gathered from earlier sources. The Byzantine tradition of scholarship and writing was not limited to men, as demonstrated most notably by the remarkable career of Anna Komnene, who lived from approximately 1083 to 1153 and who produced one of the most significant historical works of the medieval period. Anna was the daughter of Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, and she received an education unusual for a woman of any period, studying Greek literature and philosophy, rhetoric and history, mathematics and astronomy. In her later years, she composed the Alexiad, a detailed historical account of her father's reign that provides invaluable information about the Byzantine Empire during the period of the First Crusade. Anna wrote in a deliberately classical style, modeling her work on the ancient Greek historians, and she brought to her narrative both the perspective of an insider who had witnessed many events firsthand and the analytical intelligence of a trained scholar. She is often considered one of history's first female historians, a pioneer whose achievement demonstrates that intellectual excellence has never been the exclusive province of one gender. As the Byzantine Empire entered its final centuries, weakened by external pressures and internal difficulties, the scholarly tradition continued even as the political situation grew increasingly precarious. Scholars knew that their world was changing, that the empire which had sheltered them and their work for so long might not endure, and many began to look westward, to the rising states of Italy where interest in classical learning was growing and where patronage might be found. The flight of Byzantine scholars to Italy, a movement that accelerated in the decades before the final fall of Constantinople in 1453, carried with it not only the knowledge held in human minds but also physical manuscripts, the actual books that contained the preserved wisdom of antiquity. These scholars brought with them an expertise in Greek language and literature that had been maintained in Byzantium but that had largely been lost in the Latin West, and they found eager students among Italian humanists hungry to read Plato and Homer and the Greek Church Fathers in their original tongue. Among the most generous of these scholarly emigrants was Cardinal Bessarion, a learned churchman who had been born in Trebizond and who had devoted his life to scholarship and to the cause of reconciling the Eastern and Western churches. Bessarion assembled over the course of his lifetime a magnificent collection of manuscripts, both Greek and Latin, encompassing philosophy and theology, history and science, poetry and oratory. In 1468, he donated this collection, numbering 482 manuscripts in Greek and 264 in Latin, to the city of Venice, stipulating that it should form the nucleus of a public library accessible to scholars. This donation, one of the largest and most significant of the period, became the foundation of the Bibliotheca Marciana, where many of these manuscripts remain to this day. Bessarion's gift ensured that the knowledge he had spent a lifetime gathering would not be dispersed or lost but would remain available to future generations of scholars, a permanent monument to the Byzantine tradition of learning from which he came. The contribution of Byzantium to the preservation and transmission of ancient knowledge cannot be overstated, for without the patient work of Byzantine scholars, monks, and emperors across 1,000 years, much of what we know of classical civilization would simply not exist. They were not passive transmitters but active participants in the intellectual heritage they preserved, studying and commenting and sometimes correcting the texts they copied, maintaining the skills and knowledge necessary to understand what they read, and creating new works that added to the great treasury of human thought. The Renaissance that flowered in Italy in the 15th and 16th centuries, with all that it meant for the development of European art and literature and science, would have been immeasurably poorer without the Byzantine contributions that flowed into it, the manuscripts and the teachers and the scholarly traditions that came westward as the Eastern Empire fell. In this quiet way, through books and learning rather than through armies and conquests, Byzantium shaped the future of Western civilization, and we who read Plato and Aristotle and Archimedes today are the inheritors of their long labor of love. The Theodosian walls, the fortress that held for 1,000 years. In the early years of the 5th century, when the Roman Empire had already divided into its eastern and western portions, and when the child emperor Theodosius II sat upon the throne in Constantinople, there arose a great project of construction that would shape the destiny of the city for more than 1,000 years to come. The emperor himself was only a boy of 7 when work began in the year 408, and so the true architect of this monumental undertaking was a man named Anthemius, who served as the Praetorian Prefect of the East, a position of considerable administrative authority in those times. Anthemius understood, as many thoughtful administrators of that era understood, that the original walls built by Constantine the Great some 80 years earlier had become inadequate for a city that had grown so substantially in population and importance, and that the pressing movements of various peoples across the frontiers of the empire demanded stronger defenses than those which currently existed. The construction proceeded steadily over a period of approximately 5 years, from 408 until 413, during which time thousands of laborers and craftsmen worked in methodical fashion to raise what would become the most formidable system of urban fortification in the medieval world. The walls stretched for approximately 6.5 kilometers across the landward approach to the city, running in a gently curving line from the shores of the Sea of Marmara in the south to the waters of the Golden Horn in the north, thereby sealing off the peninsula upon which Constantinople stood from any army that might approach by land. This distance of 6.5 kilometers may not seem particularly vast when one considers it in abstract terms, but when one imagines the entire length covered by massive stone walls, towers, and defensive works, the scale of the achievement becomes rather more apparent. The design of the Theodosian walls incorporated a principle that military engineers call defense in depth, which means that rather than relying upon a single barrier, the fortifications presented an attacker with multiple obstacles that would need to be overcome in succession. The outermost element of this system was a great moat, a wide ditch that stretched along the entire length of the land walls and measured approximately 60 feet in width, which is to say roughly 18 meters or so in modern measurements. This moat could be flooded with water when circumstances required, transforming the approach to the walls into a formidable obstacle for any army attempting to bring siege equipment close to the fortifications. Behind the moat rose a low outer wall, sometimes called the Protychisma, which stood approximately 8 meters in height and was furnished with its own battlements and defensive positions from which soldiers could engage attackers who had managed to cross the moat. Beyond this outer wall lay a space called the Peribolos, a killing ground of sorts where attackers who had scaled the first wall would find themselves exposed to missiles from the defenders on the much larger inner wall that rose behind them. This inner wall was the true heart of the defensive system, standing approximately 12 meters in height and possessing a thickness sufficient to resist the battering rams and other siege equipment of the age. Along its length rose 96 towers, each standing even higher than the walls themselves and positioned at regular intervals so that defenders could direct flanking fire upon any attackers attempting to assault the sections of wall between them. These towers were generally square or polygonal in shape, and each contained multiple levels from which archers and other soldiers could rain projectiles upon their enemies below. The materials used in the construction of these walls were carefully chosen for their durability and strength. The builders employed a technique common in late Roman architecture, alternating courses of limestone blocks with bands of brick, which created not only a distinctive striped appearance but also provided a degree of flexibility that helped the walls withstand the earthquakes that periodically affected the region. The mortar binding these materials together was mixed according to formulas that Roman engineers had perfected over centuries, and it proved remarkably durable, holding the walls together through countless sieges and natural disasters over the millennium that followed. It is worth noting that these land walls did not exist in isolation, for the city was also protected along its maritime frontiers by extensive sea walls that ran along the shores of the Golden Horn to the north and the Sea of Marmara to the south. These sea walls were generally less massive than the land walls, as the natural difficulty of launching an assault from ships provided a degree of protection that supplemented the built fortifications. Nevertheless, they were substantial structures in their own right, and they were maintained with considerable care throughout the long history of the Byzantine Empire. One particularly ingenious feature of the city's maritime defences was the great chain that could be stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, blocking enemy ships from entering that sheltered waterway. This chain was enormously heavy, composed of massive iron links, and it was supported by wooden floats that kept it at the surface of the water where it could entangle and halt approaching vessels. When the chain was deployed, the Golden Horn became a safe harbour where the Byzantine fleet could shelter, and from which it could sally forth to attack enemy ships that had been forced to anchor in the more exposed waters of the Bosphorus or the Sea of Marmara. Among the most striking features of the Theodosian walls was the Golden Gate, a magnificent triple-arched gateway located in the southern portion of the fortifications, not far from where the walls met the Sea of Marmara. This gate served as the ceremonial entrance to the city, through which emperors would pass in triumphal procession after successful military campaigns, accompanied by their victorious armies and sometimes by captives and spoils of war. The central arch of the Golden Gate was the largest and most ornate, reserved exclusively for the emperor himself, while the two flanking arches accommodated the rest of the procession. The gate was adorned with marble cladding and decorative elements befitting its ceremonial purpose, and its name derived either from the gilded doors that once hung in its archways or from the golden light of evening that illuminated its western-facing facade. In the year 447, some 34 years after the completion of the original construction, a tremendous earthquake struck the region around Constantinople, causing extensive damage to the Theodosian walls. 57 towers collapsed entirely, and long sections of the walls were reduced to rubble, leaving the city suddenly vulnerable at a moment when the fearsome Hunnish armies of Attila were menacing the Balkans and might at any time turn their attention toward the imperial capital. The situation appeared quite desperate, for conventional wisdom held that repairing such extensive damage would require months or even years of labor, during which time the city would remain dangerously exposed. What happened next demonstrates the remarkable capacity for organization that Byzantine society could summon in times of crisis. The prefect Constantine, who held authority over the city at that time, issued a call for all available hands to assist in the reconstruction effort, and the circus factions known as the Blues and the Greens, who were ordinarily bitter rivals and whose conflicts sometimes erupted into violence in the streets, set aside their differences and worked together in common cause. These factions, which were associated with different chariot racing teams in the Hippodrome but which had evolved into something like political parties or urban militias, mobilized their members in enormous numbers, and the work proceeded with extraordinary speed. According to the accounts that have come down to us, the walls were substantially restored within just 60 days, a feat of collective effort that must have seemed almost miraculous to those who witnessed it. An inscription commemorating this achievement was placed upon the walls, recording for posterity the remarkable speed with which the damage had been repaired. The walls that emerged from this restoration were in some respects even stronger than before, as the repairs incorporated improvements and reinforcements that experience had shown to be desirable. And these strengthened fortifications would soon prove their worth, for the following years and centuries brought wave after wave of enemies to the gates of Constantinople, and time after time the Theodosian walls turned them back. The Huns under Attila, who had terrorized much of Europe and who had extracted enormous tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire, never actually besieged Constantinople directly, though they approached close enough that the emergency repairs to the walls proved most fortunate. Various factors, including the strength of the fortifications and the logistical challenges of maintaining a siege, contributed to the Hunnish decision to seek their fortunes elsewhere rather than attempting to take the city by storm. In the year 626, the city faced what many historians consider its most dangerous moment prior to the final siege of 1453. When a vast army of Avars and their Slavic allies approached the land walls while a Persian army occupied the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, hoping to coordinate a simultaneous assault from two directions. The walls held firm against repeated Avar assaults, while the Byzantine navy prevented the Persians from crossing to assist their allies, and after 10 days the siege was lifted in failure, with the Avars suffering tremendous casualties in their attempts to storm the fortifications. The Arab sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries presented a different sort of challenge, for the Arabs came with large fleets as well as armies, and they maintained their efforts over extended periods. During the siege of 674 to 678, Arab forces occupied the nearby peninsula of Cyzicus and made repeated attempts against the city over the course of several years. But the combination of the land walls, the sea walls, the Great Chain, and a fearsome weapon called Greek fire, which was a type of incendiary liquid that could burn even on water, proved sufficient to repel them. The Second Great Arab Siege of 717 to 718 was even more formidable, with an enormous fleet and army committed to the effort. But once again the defences held, aided by the harsh winter weather and by reinforcements that arrived to assist the defenders. The Rus, a people from the north who would eventually give their name to Russia, attempted to assault the city on multiple occasions during the 9th and 10th centuries, approaching by water through the Black Sea and down the Bosphorus. These attempts proved no more successful than those of previous attackers, though they did lead to interesting diplomatic and commercial relationships between Constantinople and the Rus peoples in subsequent years. The Bulgars, whose kingdom lay to the northwest of Constantinople in the Balkans, also threatened the city on numerous occasions, most notably under their fearsome Khan Krum in the early 9th century, who reportedly swore to plant his lance in the Golden Gate. Krum died before he could make his attempt, and his successors proved unable to breach the walls that had defeated so many others. Throughout all these trials, the Theodosian walls remained fundamentally sound, though they did possess certain weaknesses that thoughtful observers and determined enemies might eventually identify and exploit. One such weakness lay in the Blachany section at the northern end of the walls, near the Golden Horn. This section had been added later than the original Theodosian construction, when the city expanded beyond its earlier boundaries, and it incorporated the walls of an imperial palace complex that had not been designed with quite the same defensive rigor as the main line of fortifications. The terrain in this area was also somewhat more favorable to attackers than elsewhere along the walls. Another weak point existed in the valley of the small Lycus River, which flowed through the middle of the landward defences on its way to the Sea of Marmara. At this point, the ground dipped downward, which meant that the walls, while maintaining their absolute height, stood upon lower terrain that somewhat reduced their relative advantage over attackers. The valley also provided a natural path for directing assaults and for positioning artillery, and the walls in this section could be subjected to concentrated fire from weapons positioned on the higher ground to either side. These vulnerabilities were not fatal in themselves, and for 1,000 years they remained manageable features of an otherwise magnificent defensive system. But when the final siege came in the spring of 1453, and when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II brought against the walls not only an enormous army but also massive cannons capable of hurling stone balls of unprecedented size, These weaknesses would acquire a significance that their original builders could never have anticipated. The breaches would come in the Lycus Valley, where the dipping terrain made the walls more vulnerable to the great cannons, and the final assault would succeed in part through the Blachany section, where a small gate left open by accident allowed Ottoman soldiers to enter the city. But all of that lay far in the future during the long centuries when the Theodosian walls stood as the greatest fortification in the known world, a monument to Roman engineering and Byzantine determination, protecting the city that preserved classical learning and Christian civilization through the long medieval centuries. Night after night, watch after watch, generation after generation, soldiers walked their rounds upon those walls, looking out over the moat and the countryside beyond, keeping vigil against enemies who came and went while the walls remained, patient and enduring, until at last their 1,000 years of service came to an end. In the spring of the year 1453, the ancient city of Constantinople stood much as it had stood for over 1,000 years, its triple walls rising above the waters of the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, its domes and towers catching the light of the eastern Mediterranean sun. The city had endured many sieges across the long centuries, had watched armies come and go, had seen empires rise and crumble beyond its gates, and yet those massive Theodosian walls had never been breached by force, not in all the generations since they were first constructed in the 5th century. But now, in these final weeks of April and into May, a young sultan named Mehmed, just 21 years of age and possessed of an ambition that burned with quiet intensity, had gathered outside those walls the largest army the city had ever faced, and the defenders who watched from the ramparts could see spreading before them a host that numbered somewhere beyond 80,000 soldiers, their tents stretching across the Thracian landscape like a second city of canvas and silk. The preparations for this moment had begun long before the army arrived at the walls. In the preceding year, Mehmed had ordered the construction of a great fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, at the narrowest point of that ancient waterway, and this fortress was called Rumeli Hisari, which means the fortress of Europe, and it rose with remarkable speed, its towers and walls completed in a matter of months. The fortress stood directly across from an older Ottoman fortification on the Asian shore, and together these two strongholds controlled the strait entirely, preventing any ships from the Black Sea from bringing grain or reinforcements to Constantinople. The city, which had once commanded trade routes spanning continents, now found itself slowly strangled, its access to the wider world growing narrower with each passing season. Among the preparations that Mehmed undertook, perhaps none was more significant than the commissioning of a cannon of unprecedented size, a weapon so massive that it required 60 oxen to transport and a crew of hundreds to operate. This enormous gun was the creation of a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantine emperor but had found that the imperial treasury, depleted by centuries of decline, could not afford his price, and so Orban had traveled to the Ottoman court, where Mehmed welcomed him with great enthusiasm and provided all the resources he required. The cannon that Orban built measured some 27 feet in length, and it could hurl stone balls weighing 600 pounds or more, and when it fired, the sound could be heard from miles away, a deep thunderous roar that shook the earth and announced to all who heard it that the old rules of siege warfare were changing forever. Inside the city, the Emperor Constantine the 11th Palaiologos worked with desperate energy to prepare the defense, though he knew full well how badly he was outnumbered. The entire population of Constantinople had dwindled over the centuries from its ancient peak of perhaps 500,000 souls to something fewer than 50,000, and of these, only a portion were capable of bearing arms. When Constantine counted his defenders, he found that he could muster perhaps 7,000 men to hold walls that stretched for some 14 miles. And many of these defenders were not professional soldiers but monks and merchants and craftsmen who had taken up weapons because there was simply no one else. Among the most valuable of his forces were a company of Genoese volunteers, some 700 men led by a skilled commander named Giovanni Justiniani, who had arrived by ship with his men and his expertise and who quickly became Constantine's most trusted military advisor. The siege began formally on the 6th of April, and for 6 to 9 days the defenders held their positions against seemingly impossible odds. Each day brought new assaults, new bombardments, new attempts to breach the ancient walls, and each day the defenders somehow managed to repair what had been destroyed, to fill the gaps with rubble and timber and earth, to hold their lines against waves of Ottoman infantry. The great cannon of Auburn could only fire a few times each day, for it required hours to cool and reload. But each shot did terrible damage to the stonework that had stood for 1,000 years. And slowly, day by day, the walls began to crumble. The defenders worked through the nights by torchlight, hauling stones and debris to shore up the breaches, knowing that if they failed, the city would fall. The Golden Horn, that great inlet of water that formed the city's northern harbor, was protected by a massive iron chain that stretched across its mouth, preventing Ottoman ships from entering and attacking the sea walls from within the harbor. This chain was an ancient defense, and it had served the city well for many generations, and the Venetian and Genoese ships that had come to aid Constantinople sheltered safely behind it. But Mehmed, who was called by some the conqueror even before he had conquered anything, devised a plan of remarkable audacity. He ordered his engineers to construct a road of greased wooden logs over the hills behind the Genoese colony of Galata, and then he commanded that some 70 of his ships be dragged bodily out of the water, hauled over the hills by teams of men and oxen, and lowered into the Golden Horn on the far side of the chain. The defenders watched in disbelief as the Ottoman fleet appeared within their harbor, having bypassed the chain entirely, and now the city faced attack from yet another direction, its stretched defenses growing thinner still. Throughout the siege, the defenders hoped for relief from the Christian powers of the West, for surely, they believed, the Pope and the Italian maritime republics and the other nations of Christendom would not allow the great city of Constantine to fall into Ottoman hands. A small Venetian fleet did set out to bring aid, but it arrived too late, delayed by contrary winds and cautious commanders, and the ships that had promised to come from Genoa and other ports never materialized at all. The city was alone. Its ancient appeals to Christian solidarity answered with silence, and as May wore on and the walls grew weaker and the defenders grew fewer, even the most optimistic among them began to understand that no help would come in time. On the night of the 28th of May, knowing that the final assault would come with the dawn, the people of Constantinople gathered in the great church of Hagia Sophia for what would be their last Christian service in that sacred space. The building that Justinian had built 900 years before, with its soaring dome and its golden mosaics and its columns of green and purple stone brought from temples across the ancient world, filled with worshippers of both the Orthodox and Catholic rites. For in these final hours the old disputes between the churches seemed to matter very little. They prayed together through the night, their voices rising in the darkness, and the emperor himself attended, receiving communion one final time before returning to the walls to await the end. The final assault began in the early hours of the 29th of May, while darkness still covered the land. Mehmed sent wave after wave of his soldiers against the battered walls, beginning with the irregular troops and the volunteers who would tire the defenders before the elite Janissary corps was committed. The fighting was fierce and desperate, and for hours the outcome remained uncertain, the defenders somehow holding their positions despite exhaustion and wounds and overwhelming numbers. But then, in the chaos of battle, two things happened that would determine the fate of the city. First, a small gate in the walls called the Kerkerporta, which had been opened to allow a sortie, was either left unlocked or was found unguarded, and Ottoman soldiers began to pour through this gap into the space between the inner and outer walls. And second, Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander who had been the heart of the defense, received a severe wound, perhaps from a crossbow bolt or perhaps from a gunshot, and his men carried him from the walls despite Constantine's pleas that he remain. The loss of Giustiniani spread confusion and dismay through the ranks of the defenders, and as word of the breach at the Kerkerporta spread, the defense began to collapse. Constantine XI, seeing that all was lost, reportedly stripped off his imperial regalia so that he would not be recognized and captured, and then he charged into the mass of Ottoman soldiers, sword in hand, and was never seen again. His body was never identified with certainty among the thousands of dead, and no one knows precisely where he fell or how he died, but the last emperor of the Romans met his end as his city fell, and the dynasty that had begun with Constantine I ended with Constantine XI, 11 centuries after it began. Sultan Mehmed entered the conquered city later that day, riding through streets that had witnessed so much history, past churches and palaces and forums that bore the names of emperors dead for 1,000 years. The traditional rite of a conquering army was 3 days of plunder, and the soldiers had been promised this reward for their long siege. And so the sack of Constantinople began, as it had begun in so many other captured cities throughout the long history of warfare. But it is recorded that when Mehmed entered the great church of Hagia Sophia, he found a soldier attempting to pry up the marble floor, seeking treasure beneath the ancient stones, and the Sultan struck the man with his sword and rebuked him, saying that the soldiers might have the wealth and the captives, but the buildings belonged to him. Whether this story is precisely true in all its details we cannot say, but it reflects something of how Mehmed wished to be seen, as a conqueror who appreciated the magnificence of what he had won. There is also recorded a tradition that Mehmed, surveying the ruined and depopulated city, spoke words expressing something like melancholy at the destruction, words that have been rendered in various ways but which convey a sense of what a city we have given over to plunder and destruction. Again, we cannot know if these precise words were spoken, but they have become part of the story that history tells about that day, and they remind us that even in moments of triumph there can be a recognition of loss, a sense that something irreplaceable has passed from the world. By nightfall on that 29th of May, the great church of Hagia Sophia had been converted into a mosque, and the call to prayer was heard beneath the dome that had for so long echoed with Christian hymns. The 1,000-year empire of the Romans in the East had come to its end, and a new chapter of history had begun for the city on the Bosphorus. The city would now be called Istanbul, though the name Constantinople would linger in many languages for centuries to come, and under Ottoman rule it would flourish again, becoming the capital of an empire that would endure for nearly 500 years more. And so the Byzantine Empire passed into history, joining the long procession of states and kingdoms that have risen and fallen across the centuries, each leaving behind its traces in stone and text and memory. The scholars of Constantinople fled westward, carrying with them manuscripts of ancient Greek that would help to kindle the Renaissance in Italy and beyond. The traditions of Byzantine art and Orthodox Christianity continued in Russia and the Balkans and other lands that had been touched by Byzantine influence. And the walls that had stood for so long, now breached and broken, remained standing in their ruined state, a reminder of the city that had been and the siege that had ended it, there beneath the slow turning of the stars, as the centuries continued to pass, one after another, in their unhurried way.